Tonight we travel back beyond the first cities, beyond the first kings, beyond the first words ever pressed into clay, to a time when memory itself feels uncertain, when the world was wider, wilder, and filled with silences so profound that even the wind across the hills might have sounded like a voice from another realm. High upon a limestone ridge in what is now southeastern Turkey, there stands a place that should not exist, or at least not where we once imagined it belonged. It rises from the earth like a riddle left by vanished hands. Great stone pillars, carved and arranged in circles, were set there at a time so ancient that the pyramids of Egypt seem almost recent by comparison. This was not the work of a kingdom, not the command of an emperor, not the monument of some literate priesthood recording its triumphs for posterity. These stones were raised long before pottery, long before bronze, long before the plough had transformed the land into fields and the wandering bands of hunters into settled villagers, and yet they built. That single fact unsettles everything. For generations, the old story of civilization seemed almost neat in its progression. First came agriculture, then villages, then surplus, then hierarchy, specialization, temples, and cities. It was a clean ascent, a ladder rising from hunger toward complexity. But on this lonely hill, blasted by sun and open sky, the stones whisper another possibility. Perhaps people gathered first for reasons beyond mere survival. Perhaps belief, ceremony, fear, memory, and the pull of the sacred brought them together before crops did. Perhaps religion, or something like it, did not emerge from civilization. Perhaps it helped create civilization. It is a dangerous thought, not because it is fantastical, but because it is plausible. Imagine the ridge as it might once have been. The air is sharp in the morning, cool before the day grows hard and bright. Herds move across the grasslands below. Wild gazelle flicker over the slopes like living currents. Stands of wild einkorn wheat bend in the breeze. In the distance lie valleys, springs, and the pathways of animals that human groups had followed for generations. This was not an empty wilderness. It was a lived landscape, known intimately by people whose eyes were trained to read tracks in dust, shifts in season, the shape of a storm, the promise of water. They had no maps, yet they knew this world in ways that many of us could scarcely comprehend. They also knew stone, at some point, for reasons still partly hidden. These people chose this ridge as a focal point. They quarried the living limestone. They cut monoliths from the bedrock with tools of flint and patient force. They shaped pillars taller than a man and far heavier than anything one might expect from mobile hunter-gatherers. They lifted them upright and placed them in rings. They carved animals into their surfaces with astonishing control. Foxes, snakes, boars, birds, creatures alert and coiled with presence, moving across the stone as if emerging from a dream or warning. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. There are no long inscriptions here to guide us. No king lists, no myths written down by the builders, no clear declaration that says, "This is why we came, this is what we feared, this is whom we served." What survives instead is more haunting. A monumental space without explanation, architecture before domesticity, symbol before script, collective labour before settled life had fully taken root. It leaves us answerless, adrift to ponder whether these circles were shrines, gathering places, houses of the dead, theatres of initiation, or something stranger still that has no precise modern name. And perhaps that uncertainty is fitting. Too often the ancient world is treated as though it were populated by half-formed minds stumbling blindly toward progress. But the builders of this place were not simple. They were not waiting passively for history to begin. They stood beneath the same heavens that later inspired priests, poets, astronomers, and kings. They watched the stars wheel over the plateau. They understood animal behaviour, stone fracture, seasonal rhythms, and social bonds with extraordinary subtlety. They may not have had cities, but they had imagination. They may not have written epics, but they were capable of shaping one in stone. This is what lends the site its strange emotional force. It is not merely old, it is intimate with beginnings. When you look upon it, You're not staring at the crude first attempt of humanity to build something meaningful. You're witnessing a confidence that appears almost fully formed. That is the true shock. The artistic control, the organisation, the symbolic boldness, the sheer ambition of the undertaking all suggest that what we have found is not the awkward dawn of sacred architecture, but the surviving crest of a much deeper tradition, one whose roots may sink into ages for which little evidence remains. Radiocarbon dating places the earliest activity here in the pre-pottery Neolithic. Roughly in the 10th millennium BC, that date alone is staggering. Stratigraphic excavation has revealed successive layers of construction, use, burial, and renewal. The site was not built in one single moment of inspiration. It evolved. Enclosures were raised, altered, and in some cases deliberately buried. That act of burial is itself one of the great mysteries. These were not ruins abandoned to chance. They were entombed, almost reverently, as though one sacred order were being closed by the very people who had sustained it. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. For now, we stand at the threshold of a world in transition. The Ice Age had loosened its grip. Climates shifted. Landscapes opened and contracted. Human communities adapted, experimented, gathered, and remembered. Somewhere in that vast unwritten drama, on a hill that would one day be called Göbekli Tepe, they set stone against sky and made a statement so powerful that it still reaches us across 11,000 years. Not with certainty, not with a single message, but with a challenge to reconsider what it means to become human, to ask whether our first great monuments were born not from comfort, but from longing, not from settled abundance, but from the need to bind people together beneath symbols greater than themselves, on that ridge, among carved pillars and buried circles. The ancient world does not feel dead, it feels watchful, as if the first temple, if temple it was, still waits for us to understand why it had to be built. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you are listening tonight, post your location and your local time in the comments below. The ridge itself is the first clue. Long before anyone cut a pillar or carved the curling body of a serpent into stone, this hill already possessed a presence that must have mattered. It rises from the Harran Plain in southeastern Anatolia, a broad-backed limestone prominence with commanding views over the surrounding country. Even now, when the modern world presses closer than it once did, there is something set apart about it. The land opens in all directions. The horizon feels generous. Light arrives unbroken. Wind moves over the crest with a strange steadiness, and the earth underfoot carries the pale hardness of exposed bedrock, as if the hill were not merely covered by a stone but made of it in essence. Its modern name, Göbekli Tepe, is often translated as Potbelly Hill or Hill of the Navel, a phrase that sounds almost playful until one stands with the landscape in mind and senses why people, ancient or modern, might have recognized this as a natural center. It is not the highest place in the region, nor the most dramatic, but it is prominent in a subtler way. It draws the eye not through jagged grandeur, but through its poised visibility. A hill like this becomes a marker, a meeting point, a place that can be seen from afar and reached from many directions. In a world without roads, signs, or written coordinates, such places mattered immensely. Yet the meaning of Göbekli Tepe is not just topographic. It belongs to a much larger environmental stage, one that was in flux at the end of the last ice age. Around the time its earliest monumental phases began, this region occupied a remarkable ecological frontier. To the south and east stretched the lands that would later nourish some of the earliest farming communities in human history. To the north and west lay uplands, valleys, and plateaus rich in seasonal diversity. This was a zone where wild resources converged with unusual abundance. Water sources were scattered across the broader landscape, herd animals passed through, wild grasses flourished, almond, pistachio, and other useful plants could be found in surrounding environments. The people moving across this world were not trapped in a barren wasteland. They lived within a mosaic of opportunity. That matters because it changes the atmosphere in which the site must be imagined. The old stereotype of prehistoric existence often leans toward desperation, as though the human past consisted mainly of hunger, fear, and constant struggle. Certainly those things were real. Life was precarious, injury, disease, climatic instability, and failed hunts could all turn a season grim. But landscapes like this one also offered periodic richness, and it is within such richness that large gatherings become thinkable. People could come together here not because they had conquered nature in the later agricultural sense, but because they knew how to live within its patterns. They knew when the gazelle would move. They knew where edible plants could be found. They knew which seasons favoured congregation and which favoured dispersal. The hill stood within a lived geography of movement, memory, and return. You can picture small groups approaching it from different directions, across the late spring grasslands, over ridges and through shallow valleys. Families and bands would have come bearing tools, stories, obligations, perhaps even rivalries. Some may have walked for days. Others may have known the place from childhood and returned with a sense of duty or wonder. Fires would have flickered along the slopes. Voices would have carried in the dry air. There may have been periods when the ridge lay nearly still, and others when it swelled with people. The hill was not a city. It had no dense permanent population in the urban sense. But that does not mean it lacked social gravity. In a mobile world, a place can be central without being continuously inhabited. The bedrock itself shaped what could happen here. Limestone is workable, but not soft. It yields to persistence. Across the hilltop, outcrops offered both material and foundation. Builders did not need to transport every great block from distant quarries. In many cases, they could extract monoliths directly from the ridge and set them into enclosures on the same elevated ground. This practical advantage should not be underestimated. Sacredness often converges with utility. The place was symbolically powerful, perhaps, but it was also materially suited to monumental construction. The geology gave the imagination something to work with. And then there is the sky. On a ridge like this, the heavens are not background. They dominate experience. Dawn spreads without obstruction. Evening descends across immense space. Stars emerge in extraordinary number when the dark deepens. For people living close to seasonal rhythms, celestial regularities would have been among the most dependable structures in existence. It is tempting, perhaps too tempting, to read astronomical intent into every ancient monument. Caution is wise. Yet even without forcing alignments or hidden codes, one can say with confidence that a place like Göbekli Tepe would have immersed its builders in the drama of sky and land meeting. Ritual in such a setting would have unfolded not in enclosed secrecy, but under a vast visible cosmos. The animals of the region also belonged to this setting in a profound way. This was a landscape of gazelle, fox, wild boar, horrocks, birds of prey, and snakes. These were not distant creatures glimpsed occasionally from safety. They were neighbours, threats, prey, symbols, and companions in thought. Human life here depended on knowing them intimately. The ridge overlooked not just scenery, but a field of relations between species. That helps explain why animal imagery later appears so insistently in the carved world of the site. The setting and the symbolic program are intertwined. The hill was a vantage point over an animate world charged with significance. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know exactly what the hill was called by those who first gathered there. We do not know what emotions it stirred in a child climbing it for the first time, or in an elder returning after many seasons away. We do not know whether its sacred character arose from a vision, a memory, a burial, a habit of gathering, or simply from the strange magnetism of a place that seemed right. Human beings have always attached meaning to landscapes, but the first act of naming that meaning is almost never preserved. What is preserved is the fit between environment and ambition. Göbekli Tepe did not appear in isolation from its world. It emerged from a particular conjunction of climate, ecology, geology, and human mobility. It stood within the northern arc of the Fertile Crescent, that broad zone where some of the deepest transformations in human history would unfold. But here, on this hill, those transformations had not yet settled into the ordinary grammar of village life. The ridge belongs to a threshold age, when people still moved through wild abundance, yet had begun to gather in ways that hinted at something new. The land held enough to sustain them, and the hill offered a stage on which belief, memory, and cooperation could become visible in stone. Perhaps that is why the place still affects the imagination so strongly. It is not only ancient, it occupies a moment when the earth itself seems to be waiting. The ice has retreated, the grasses rise, the herds move. Human communities are alert to change, though they cannot know the scale of what lies ahead. On a limestone summit under the open sky, they begin to shape a centre, not yet a town, not yet a kingdom, but undeniably a place apart, a place where the land, for a little while, became more than land. For a very long time, Göbekli Tepe was not famous. It did not stride across the modern imagination with the instant authority of Stonehenge or the pyramids. There were no grand legends stitched tightly to its name in global memory. No classical chroniclers described its sanctuaries. No medieval pilgrims left accounts of its wonders. The hill simply sat beneath the sun, season after season, century after century, carrying its burden of buried stone in silence. Dust gathered, soil thickened, grass took root. Shepherds moved over the land. Villagers lived within sight of a mound whose deepest significance had long since passed out of human speech. That silence is one of the most astonishing parts of the story. So often, when we think of monumental places, we imagine a continuous chain of remembrance. We assume that something extraordinary leaves some echo in the traditions that follow. But that is not always how history works. Memory can be severed. A sacred centre can become an anonymous hill. A place once charged with ritual gravity can vanish so completely from cultural awareness that even when people stand upon it, they do not know what lies under their feet. The world is full of such forgotten elevations, such harmless-looking rises in the land beneath which older realities sleep. Göbekli Tepe was one of them. By the 20th century, the mound was known locally, of course, as a feature of the landscape. Farmers noticed worked stones here and there. Scatters of flint could be found. The surface suggested antiquity, but antiquity in this region is almost everywhere. Southeastern Anatolia is dense with human traces, tells mounds formed by repeated occupation over generations lie across the countryside like low archives of mud brick, ash, bone, and debris. To a casual or even trained eye, a hill such as this might not immediately declare itself unique. It could be mistaken for a settlement mound, a place where ordinary habitation had accumulated layer upon layer through time, and in the earlier years, that is close to what happened. Survey teams recorded the site in the 1960s. Fragments on the surface were noted, certain stone elements were seen, yet the place did not reveal itself clearly enough to overturn first impressions. Some of the protruding limestone blocks were interpreted as grave markers from much later periods. That was not an unreasonable mistake. Archaeology often begins in ambiguity. Sites do not announce their full age and function at first glance. They offer hints, and those hints are filtered through the expectations of the present. When scholars look at a landscape, they are not blank minds receiving truth directly from the ground. They are interpreters, and interpretation is shaped by what seems plausible. At that time, a hilltop mound with visible stones was easier to classify within familiar categories than to recognize as a monumental ritual complex from the pre-pottery Neolithic. The idea simply sat too far outside the expected order of things. It would have required someone to imagine, before the evidence was fully exposed, that hunter-gatherers on this ridge had created architecture of startling sophistication. That was not the story archaeology was prepared to tell. So the hill remained, recorded but unrevealed. There is something almost moving in that. The buried pillars lay below, immense and patient, while scholars passed nearby with only partial understanding. This was not negligence in any crude sense. It was the ordinary condition of knowledge. The past is not merely hidden by earth, it is also hidden by the limits of the questions we are ready to ask. Sometimes a discovery must wait not only for excavation, but for a shift in imagination. The mound itself helped preserve the secret. Unlike ruins left standing in dramatic exposure, Göbekli Tepe had been intentionally backfilled in antiquity. Its enclosures were packed with stone fragments, debris, animal bone, and soil. Over immense spans of time, This produced the appearance of a broad swelling in the landscape rather than an obvious ceremonial ruin. The architecture did not tower in broken silhouette against the horizon. It slept beneath accumulated fill, protected by the very act that had concealed it. A sacred place was hidden so effectively that its concealment became part of its survival. One might almost say that the site was waiting for the right encounter. That encounter came when closer attention began to be paid to the hill in the 1990s. By then, archaeological understanding of the Neolithic in Upper Mesopotamia had advanced significantly. Other early sites had already begun to complicate older narratives of how settled life emerged. Researchers were increasingly alert to the idea that the deep past of this region might hold surprises. When trained eyes returned to Göbekli Tepe and looked more carefully at the worked stones, the lithic scatters, the shape of the mound, and the implications of the surface evidence, the old assumptions began to weaken. This is often how revelation begins, not with spectacle, but with discomfort. Something does not fit. A stone is too large, too carefully made, too deeply weathered, too oddly placed. A surface scatter belongs to a period earlier than expected. A pattern appears where random debris should be. The mind resists at first, then circles back. Once doubt enters, the whole landscape changes. At Göbekli Tepe, the hill that had seemed merely ancient began to look extraordinarily ancient. Soon the realization emerged that the protruding stones were not modest grave markers or late intrusions, but the upper parts of much older monoliths. What had been mistaken for the ordinary was in fact the visible edge of something buried on a scale no one had anticipated. Beneath the mound lay architecture from a time before pottery, before settled urban life, before the conventional sequence that had placed monumental ritual at a much later stage. The hill was not simply old, it was primordial in archaeological terms, one of those rare places that forced the discipline itself to pause. Imagine that moment, not in romantic fantasy, but in its actual intellectual force. To stand on a mound long noted yet little understood, and to realize that below lies a ceremonial complex over 11,000 years old, is to feel the ground shift beneath more than your boots. Entire models of prehistory begin to wobble. Questions multiply. How many people built this? Why here? Why so early? What forms of leadership and coordination and symbolic life made it possible? The discovery was not just of a site, but of a problem. A magnificent and unsettling problem that would challenge archaeology for decades. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The forgotten mound had spoken, but only partially. Excavation would reveal circles, pillars, carvings, and deposits in remarkable preservation. Yet even in discovery, Göbekli Tepe withheld easy answers. It did not step neatly into the categories available to modern thought. Was it a temple complex with no settlement? A gathering place for dispersed communities, a ceremonial ridge where feasting, burial, memory, and cosmic symbolism met? The hill had re-entered history, but not in a form that restored certainty. It returned instead as a deeper enigma. That may be the most fitting resurrection of all. For thousands of years, the mound endured without fame. Wind crossed it, rain darkened it, sheep trod its flanks. Human eyes saw it and passed on. Then, through the slow correction of perception, it was recognized not as a minor relic, but as one of the great archaeological shocks of the modern age. The forgotten hill was forgotten no longer, and yet it remains, in essence, a place recovered from oblivion only in part. Its name is known now. Its stones have risen again into the light, but the people who chose it, filled it, honored it, and abandoned it are still only dimly visible, like forms half seen beneath the earth. When the excavations truly began to bite into the mound, Göbekli Tepe started yielding the kind of evidence that makes old certainties feel embarrassingly fragile. This was no ordinary hilltop settlement. The soil and rubble, once cleared with methodical care, revealed the upper portions of immense limestone pillars set in circular and oval enclosures. Each season of excavation widened the scale of the surprise. What had seemed from the surface like isolated worked stones became an architectural language. Pillars stood around the edges of carefully prepared spaces. Two larger monoliths often occupied the centre. Walls linked the uprights. Floors had been worked, levelled, and in places cut directly into the bedrock. This was design, not accident. Planning, not improvisation. Archaeology at its best advances not through drama alone, but through discipline. Stratigraphic excavation allowed each layer of the mound to be read as a sequence of actions. Deposits were not simply removed, they were interpreted. Fill layers, wall lines, tool fragments, faunal remains, and the relationship between one architectural phase and another all mattered. The mound became a document, not of words, but of decisions. Every trench opened a conversation between what was visible and what had once happened here. It was within this disciplined reading of the earth that the great revelation sharpened. The earliest monumental levels belonged to the pre-pottery Neolithic. That dating changed everything. Radiocarbon samples taken from organic material associated with the enclosures indicated ages reaching back into the 10th millennium BC. The implications were staggering. These circles were not the products of mature agricultural societies. They predated the conventional urban chain of temple, palace, bureaucracy, and kingdom by several thousand years. The people who built them had no ceramics, no metal tools, no writing, and no draft animals. Yet they possessed the capacity to extract, shape, transport, and erase multi-ton pillars with symbolic sophistication. Klaus Schmidt, the German archaeologist most closely associated with the site's recognition and early excavation, understood very quickly that Göbekli Tepe was not merely important, it was disruptive. He saw that the mound challenged the prevailing logic of the Neolithic transition. If these enclosures were fundamentally ritual in nature, and if they were built before widespread settled farming had fully developed, then the old sequence of progress might need serious revision. Monumentality had appeared astonishingly early. Organised symbolic labour had come before many scholars thought possible. This was the eureka moment. Though like most genuine scientific revelations, it did not arrive as a single flash detached from evidence. It emerged as the evidence accumulated to the point where denial became harder than revision. The pillars themselves were persuasive enough. Many were T-shaped, with a form unlike ordinary building supports. Some bore low relief carvings of animals. Others carried arms, hands, belts, and loincloth-like details, suggesting that the pillars were not inert stones but stylized beings, perhaps anthropomorphic presences rendered in severe abstraction. These were not just structural elements. They were participants in meaning. Imagine what it must have felt like to stand in one of those excavated enclosures as the forms came back into view. The mound is opened. Dust hangs in the air. Limestone surfaces that had not seen daylight for millennia begin to emerge in pale brightness. A fox runs across the face of one pillar, a serpent coils along another. Vultures, boars, and predatory creatures appear with an intensity that still feels charged. Then the central monoliths rise from the trench, taller and more commanding than those around them, facing one another in silence. It is difficult not to feel that one has entered a preserved idea, a chamber of intention from an age that should have left so little and yet left this. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. Excavation did not uncover a tidy site plan that answered every question. Quite the opposite. The more that appeared, the more complicated the place became. Several large enclosures were identified, often labelled with letters for convenience. Each had its own architectural nuances. Some seemed earlier, some later. Some pillars had richer carvings than others. There were also later, smaller rectangular structures in upper levels, indicating that the site changed over time. Göbekli Tepe was not frozen in a single ceremonial moment. It had a history of building, rebuilding, modification, and eventual burial. That history is what gives the excavation its real depth. The mound was not a single monument, but a layered process. Quarry marks showed where stone had been extracted from nearby bedrock. Unfinished pillars suggested interrupted labour or changing plans. Flint tools and debris from lithic analysis illuminated the technical world of the builders. Animal bone deposits hinted at large-scale consumption, and perhaps communal feasting. The site was never just about carved stone. It was about a whole system of effort, gathering, and symbolic action. One of the most extraordinary findings was that many of the enclosures had been intentionally backfilled. This was not simple abandonment. Huge amounts of debris, including broken limestone, animal bones, and chipped stone, had been used to bury the monumental spaces. Such deliberate infilling implies decision, perhaps even ceremony. A sacred place may have been closed by its own custodians. If so, then burial was not destruction in any casual sense, but transformation. The architecture was hidden, preserved, and removed from use all at once. This act of entombment deepened the mystery. Why bury so much labour? Why conceal what had required such coordination to create? Was this a response to social change, theological change, environmental pressure, or a ritual logic now lost to us? The trench walls offered clues, but not final answers. Archaeology can recover sequence more easily than intention. It can tell us that something happened with great care. It cannot always tell us why the hands moved as they did. Schmidt and his colleagues pushed the interpretation that Göbekli Tepe represented a ceremonial centre used by hunter-gatherer groups from a wider region. This was a bold and influential reading, and it helped frame the site for the world. At the same time, debate followed, as it should. Some scholars questioned whether domestic activity might have been more significant than first assumed. Others wondered whether the distinction between sacred and everyday life imposed too modern a division on a prehistoric world. A place could be ritually central and still deeply entangled with subsistence, seasonal residence, craft work, and social negotiation. What no serious observer could deny, however, was the force of the archaeological reality. Göbekli Tepe had exposed a level of monumental construction and symbolic expression from a period once imagined as too early for such achievements. That is why the excavations mattered so profoundly. They did not merely add another site to the prehistoric map. They forced archaeology to look again at its own assumptions about complexity, labour, and belief. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. Much of the mound remains unexcavated even now. Geophysical surveys suggest that more enclosures lie beneath the surface, their forms still hidden in the limestone hill. What has been uncovered may represent only a portion of the full site. That fact should keep us humble. Every statement about Göbekli Tepe remains provisional in some degree. The hill has already surprised us once by being what no one expected. It may do so again. For now, the revelation stands. Under careful stratigraphic excavation, a forgotten mound became a monumental archive of early ritual life. Under the eye of archaeology, stone circles emerged from silence and demanded a new account of humanity's beginnings. Not an easy account, not a settled one, but a richer and stranger one, in which the first great architecture may have risen from the minds of people still moving through a wild world, gathering not because they had already become civilized, but because in gathering they were becoming something new. Once a place like Göbekli Tepe enters public awareness, it rarely remains only an archaeological site. It becomes something else as well. A magnet for speculation, a screen for longing, a vessel into which modern minds pour questions far larger than stone and soil alone can answer. That transformation began almost at once. The hill that had spent millennia in obscurity suddenly stood at the centre of one of the most astonishing stories in early human history. Older than pottery, older than cities, older than the conventional architecture of kingship and organised states. It seemed to reach back into an age so remote that many people, on first hearing of it, felt the same sharp disbelief. How could such a place exist? How could people at that stage of prehistory have imagined and built something so monumental? It is exactly in that gap between expectation and evidence that legend begins. Not ancient legend in the strict recorded sense, for the builders left us no written myths attached to the site. Rather, what emerged was a modern halo of wonder. Journalists called it the world's first temple. Documentarians framed it as a revolutionary puzzle. Viewers encountering the site through photographs and aerial images felt the thrill of standing at the edge of the known. The giant T-shaped pillars, with their severe forms and carved predators, looked both deeply archaic and strangely intelligent, as if they belonged to a symbolic order more mature than they ought to be. The effect on the imagination was immediate. And into that imagination rushed all the familiar currents of human interpretation. Some saw the site as proof that religion is the oldest organising force in our species, older perhaps than farming itself. Others treated it as evidence that forgotten knowledge had once flourished in a lost age and then slipped away. Some reached for cosmic explanations, seeing in its carvings and layout hints of star cults, celestial maps, or messages from vanished wisdom traditions. Others, more cautious, found enough wonder in the verified facts alone. Huge pillars, deliberate design, extraordinary age, intentional burial, a sacred complex built by people without writing or metal. No embellishment was needed. The truth already possessed the weight of myth. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. That sentence could almost serve as the emotional centre of Göbekli Tepe's modern life. It's what draws people so powerfully toward the site. Not certainty, but nearness to certainty. Not a solved story, but a threshold where evidence is rich enough to provoke awe and sparse enough to preserve mystery. Many archaeological places are important. Fewer are haunting. Göbekli Tepe is haunting because it gives us form without voice. The pillars stand, the reliefs survive, the architecture can be mapped. Yet the inner language of the place remains sealed. We do not know what words were spoken in its enclosures. We do not know what prayers, if prayers they were, rose into the Anatolian night. We do not know whether the people who gathered there trembled, rejoiced, mourned, feasted, competed, or submitted. We know there was meaning. We do not know its name. This silence has allowed the site to gather a second life in the modern world, one built from echoes, analogies, and desire. People long for origins. They want the first temple, the first god, the first city, the first monument, as if human history can be made legible through dramatic beginnings. Göbekli Tepe seems to promise such a beginning. It appears at the edge of prehistory with exactly the right mixture of grandeur and obscurity. It feels foundational, yet it also resists the neatness of origin stories. The more closely one looks, the less it behaves like a simple first chapter. It seems instead like the surviving crest of a deeper and already mature symbolic tradition. That is what makes it so difficult to domesticate intellectually. The animal reliefs do not behave like decorative afterthoughts. The central pillars do not look like mere supports. The enclosures are not casual gathering spots. Everything suggests intentionality, but intentionality of a kind already developed. The builders were not experimenting clumsily with the idea of sacred space. They appear to have known what they were doing, and if they knew what they were doing, then their knowledge came from somewhere, from customs, beliefs, and mental worlds already in motion long before the ridge was transformed. Göbekli Tepe is not only a discovery, it is a signpost pointing beyond itself toward older, less visible histories. That is where legend and scholarship begin to circle one another. The scholar says remain disciplined, stay with the evidence, read the stone, the faunal deposits, the lithics, the stratigraphy. The legend maker says this cannot be all. There must be a lost memory here, a broken inheritance, a threshold into a forgotten human age. Both responses arise naturally from the site, though only one is bound by method. Yet it would be wrong to dismiss wonder too quickly. Wonder is often the emotional recognition that a fact has exceeded the frameworks built to contain it. Göbekli Tepe deserves wonder. It simply demands that wonder be paired with restraint. The local landscape, too, has its own quieter aura. Hills like this are never merely coordinates on a map to the people who live around them. Even when ancient meanings have vanished, a rise in the land, an outcrop with old stones, a place where worked fragments appear after rain, can acquire a muted significance. People notice such places. They graze animals near them, walk across them, perhaps tell small stories about them, perhaps not. Not every sacred site preserves a continuous oral memory, but many preserve a kind of felt distinctness. A hill can remain set apart even when no one remembers why. Perhaps that was true here as well. Answerless, adrift to ponder. We are left with a place that seems to generate reverence in every era for different reasons. For its builders, perhaps, it was a centre of ritual gravity. For the long centuries after its burial, it became part of the sleeping earth, For archaeologists, it became a revolution in stone. For the wider public, it has become one of those rare prehistoric places that feel almost cinematic in scale. Not because of fantasy, but because the reality is already so improbable. And yet Göbekli Tepe may be offering something subtler than a revelation about gods or temples alone. It may be showing us that human beings were capable of enormous symbolic ambition before the social forms we usually associate with ambition had fully arrived. We often imagine complexity as something that hardens gradually from practical needs, from food storage, property, labour accounting, territorial management. But here is another possibility. Here is complexity gathering first around ceremony, image, memory, danger, death, and the invisible. A people still close to the wild world chose to shape a hill into a theatre of meaning. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. Until then, Göbekli Tepe remains suspended between evidence and enchantment. Its stones have re-entered the light, but not the full language that once animated them. That absence is not a failure. It is part of the site's power. It reminds us that the first great monuments of humankind may not have been built to explain the world clearly. They may have been built because the world already felt immense, perilous, beautiful, and charged with presences just beyond understanding. And so the hill continues to do what it has always done. It gathers attention. It holds silence. It compels the modern mind, just as it once must have compelled the ancient one, to stand still for a moment beneath the open sky and feel that something meaningful happened here. Something large enough to outlast language, burial, and time itself. To understand why Göbekli Tepe could appear when it did, you have to step into a world still trembling from climatic shock. The end of the last ice age was not a smooth awakening into warmth and stability. It was a broken transition, interrupted by reversals, pulses, and long stretches of uncertainty. Around the close of the Pleistocene, human communities across Southwest Asia were already adapting to changing conditions. Ice sheets far to the north were withdrawing, temperatures, in broad terms, were rising, landscapes were shifting, plant communities expanded into new zones, animal ranges altered as rivers, springs, and wetlands changed character. It was a world in motion, and human beings were moving with it, adjusting their seasonal rounds, their hunting strategies, and perhaps even their expectations of what the land could offer. Then came the Younger Dryas, this abrupt climatic downturn, beginning around 10,900 BC, brought colder and drier conditions to many parts of the northern hemisphere. In the Near East, the exact local consequences varied from region to region, but the larger truth is clear enough. Stability faltered. Ecological patterns that communities had come to know were disrupted. Some areas became less reliable. Certain wild resources may have fluctuated sharply. The old abundance did not simply vanish, but it became harder to predict. For people whose survival depended on reading the land with extraordinary precision, such unpredictability was no small matter. It was not just weather. It was pressure on the very grammar of a life. By the time activity began at Göbekli Tepe in the 10th millennium BC, the Younger Dryas was ending or had only recently ended depending on the precise phase under discussion, and the region was moving into the warmer conditions of the early Holocene. Yet transitions like these do not erase their own memory. Human communities do not experience climate as charts and averages. They experience it as dry springs, thin herds, altered migration routes, unfamiliar growth patterns, failed expectations. Ecological stress and ecological opportunity often arrive together. A warming world could bring richer possibilities, but also demand new forms of coordination and adaptation. This matters deeply for Göbekli Tepe because the site does not belong to an age of settled security. It belongs to a threshold. The people of this ridge lived close to wild grain stands, game-rich environments, and varied upland ecologies, but they were also heirs to a long period in which environmental change had forced flexibility, resilience, and experimentation. In such a world, gathering people together on a large scale may have served more than one function. It may have been ritual. It may have been social insurance. It may have been a way to reinforce ties, exchange knowledge, arrange marriages, negotiate access, and create shared meaning in a landscape where uncertainty remained a constant companion. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We cannot draw a straight line from climate event to temple building. Human life is never so mechanically simple. But the environmental context creates the stage upon which social transformation becomes possible. In the hills and plains of Upper Mesopotamia, the early Holocene brought a remarkable conjunction of resources. Wildine corn and emmer wheat grew in nearby zones. Gazelle and other game moved across the landscape. Pistachio, almond, and edible plants contributed to seasonal abundance. Springs and local water sources made parts of the region highly attractive for repeated use. This was not yet an agricultural world in the full domestic sense, but it was a world rich enough to support aggregation, especially at certain times of year. Picture the plateau after winter rains. The grasses rise, the air carries the smell of damp earth and crushed herbs. Herds move through the open country. Birdsong returns to the valleys. Under these conditions, people could gather in larger numbers than one might assume if one imagines all hunter-gatherers as thinly scattered and constantly desperate. Complexity does not require permanent urban density at every stage. It can emerge seasonally. It can gather and disperse like the animals themselves. The hilltop sanctuary, if sanctuary it was, may have depended on exactly this rhythm of ecological pulse and human return. Environmental data from the wider region supports the idea that the northern Fertile Crescent was one of the crucial zones in which the relationship between humans and useful plants began to intensify. This does not mean that farmers suddenly appeared fully formed. Domestication is slow, it is hesitant. It involves generations of observation, harvesting, re-sowing, protecting, selecting, and living close enough to landscapes that certain species begin to change under human attention. Göbekli Tepe stands near the heartland of wild progenitors, especially for early cereals, and that is unlikely to be accidental. The people gathering here were embedded in environments that would soon become central to one of the greatest transformations in human history, yet we should resist making climate into destiny. The end of the Younger Dryas did not force people automatically into farming, nor did environmental stress alone produce symbolic monumentality. Human beings interpret pressure through culture. Two communities can face similar ecological strain and respond differently depending on belief, memory, leadership, and social ties. What Göbekli Tepe suggests is not that climate caused religion, but that in times of transition, ritual gathering may have become one of the ways people organize themselves against uncertainty. The sacred in such a setting is not separate from survival. It is one of the methods by which survival becomes socially possible. There is another dimension as well. Changing climate changes not only subsistence but perception. When familiar patterns break and new ones emerge, people become acutely aware of thresholds. The world no longer feels fixed. It feels volatile, alive, perhaps morally charged. Storms, droughts, recoveries, migrations, sudden abundance after scarcity. All of this can intensify a sense that humans live within forces far larger than themselves. Ritual architecture may arise in part from that recognition, not as abstract theology in the later literate sense, but as embodied response. Gather here, build here, mark this place. Stand together under symbols that speak of power, danger, death, and continuity. Answerless, adrift to ponder, we can only imagine how the people of this region spoke about change. Did elders tell of colder times? Did certain valleys fail and recover? Did animal routes shift enough to alter tradition? Did memories of instability sharpen the desire for durable gathering places? The stones do not answer directly, but the chronology is suggestive. Göbekli Tepe appears not in a static world, but in the aftermath of climatic turbulence and on the edge of ecological reorganization. It belongs to a moment when humans were rethinking their place in nature, even if they would never have framed it in those terms. Radiocarbon dating gives us sequence. Archaeobotany gives us plants. Zooarchaeology gives us prey patterns. Paleoclimatic proxies from lake cores, ice records, and regional studies give us broad environmental structure. Together they create not certainty, but a powerful background. On the Anatolian Plateau and its neighbouring landscapes, The old Ice Age world was gone. A new one was arriving. Humans were no longer simply moving through inherited patterns. They were beginning, perhaps for the first time on a major scale, to shape lasting centres in response to those patterns. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. For now, what emerges is a picture of Göbekli Tepe as a monument born in an age of environmental transition. Not a refuge from nature, but a place built within nature's instability. The hill rose above a world of changing rains, shifting grasses, mobile herds, and wild cereals on the cusp of transformation. Its builders were not passive victims of climate, nor were they detached engineers mastering it from afar. They were participants in a living landscape, using memory, labour, and symbol to create a centre, while the world around them was still becoming something new. The people who came to Göbekli Tepe were not villagers in the later sense. They did not wake each morning inside dense farming settlements bordered by fixed fields and permanent property lines. They belonged instead to a mobile world, one shaped by movement, memory, and seasonal return. To modernise, mobility often appears fragile, almost transitional, as though people who moved with the land must have been waiting for a more advanced way of life to arrive. But that assumption can be misleading. Mobile hunter-gatherers were not unfinished farmers. They were highly skilled communities whose knowledge of terrain, plants, water, animal behaviour, and one another was profound. Their world was demanding, but it was not simple. Across the limestone plateaus, valleys, and open steppe lands of Upper Mesopotamia, these communities lived by reading the rhythms of nature with remarkable precision. They knew where gazelle passed in season. They knew where stands of wild grain ripened and where edible roots, nuts, and fruits could be gathered. They understood the habits of fox, boar, aurochs, and birds. They knew which stone outcrops offered good material for tools and which springs could be trusted late in the dry months. Their lives were built on a deep mental map, not written down, but carried in memory, gesture, and practice. That map was social as much as environmental. No human group survives through technical knowledge alone. To move through a broad landscape and return repeatedly to key places requires relationships. Bands must recognize one another. Partnerships must be formed and renewed. Mating networks must extend beyond the smallest local group. Information must pass across generations and between neighbouring communities. There are obligations, rivalries, exchanges, and moments of tension. In such a world, gathering places become essential. They are where kinship is refreshed. Disputes are softened or sharpened. Goods are shared. Ritual is performed, and belonging is made visible. Göbekli Tepe may have been one of those places on an extraordinary scale. The faunal remains recovered from the site suggest a world still oriented strongly around wild game rather than domesticated herds. Gazelle appear prominently, along with other hunted animals. This points towards subsistence based on skilled procurement, not pastoral management. Lithic analysis likewise reveals a sophisticated stone tool culture, one adapted to hunting, butchery, cutting, scraping, and the many practical tasks of a mobile life. Flint was selected, shaped, repaired, and carried with care. These were not crude implements. They were the result of inherited expertise, a good blade or point condensed knowledge gathered over generations. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know the names these people used for themselves. We do not know what language they spoke, what songs they carried through the night, or how they explained the difference between an ordinary hill and one fit for carved pillars. But archaeology allows some cautious inferences about how they may have lived. Their communities were likely flexible in size, dispersing at some times of year and aggregating at others. Small groups may have travelled separately for much of the annual cycle, then converged when resources were abundant or when ritual obligations required attendance. Such social elasticity is common in foraging worlds. It allows resilience. It also creates the conditions for dramatic communal events. Imagine such an arrival. A few people appear first along a ridge path, carrying flint, skins, baskets, perhaps prepared food. Then others emerge from another direction, and then more. Fires are lit, greetings are exchanged, news passes between people who have not seen one another for months. Children stare at unfamiliar faces. Hunters compare routes and sightings. Elders measure the mood of the gathering. Somewhere work begins on stone, or meat is processed, or plans are quietly discussed. In the modern imagination, ritual and subsistence are often separated into clean categories. In a prehistoric aggregation, they would have overlapped constantly. To gather was to eat, to build, to perform, to remember, to negotiate. The builders of Göbekli Tepe must have possessed not only physical strength, but organizational intelligence. To quarry and erase monoliths required labor coordination, perhaps over extended periods. That does not necessarily imply kings or permanent elites in the later sense. Authority can exist in temporary situational forms. Certain individuals may have directed work because they were respected stoneworkers, ritual specialists, seasoned elders, or persuasive leaders. Others may have held prestige through hunting skill, memory of custom, or control over ceremonial knowledge. Social differentiation need not begin as rigid hierarchy. It can emerge subtly in the unequal weight carried by certain voices. Their diet, too, would have reflected the abundance and variability of the region. Meat from hunted animals provided protein and fat, but plant foods almost certainly contributed more than older stereotypes once allowed. Wild cereals, gathered seeds, nuts, fruits, legumes, and tubers would have enriched the menu depending on season and location. Processing these foods took time and skill. Grinding, roasting, cutting, storing for short periods, and sharing all formed part of daily life. The people who came to Göbekli Tepe were not simply chasing prey across empty land. They were participants in a textured subsistence economy, one that mixed movement with repeated use of key ecological zones. This is important because it suggests a world already capable of producing surplus moments, not permanent abundance, but enough concentrated food at certain times to support gatherings larger than the smallest family band. Feasting may have occurred here. If so, it would have carried immense social force. A feast is never only about calories. It is display, obligation, alliance, memory, and rank in potential form. To feed many people is to create a moment of shared significance. Animal bone deposits at the site hint that consumption on a notable scale took place. Whether these events were seasonal celebrations, rites of passage, funerary commemorations, or something else, they suggest that Göbekli Tepe was animated by crowds, not solitary visitation. There is also the question of worldview. Hunter-gatherers living so closely with animals, weather, death, and migration do not divide the world into neat modern compartments. The boundary between human and non-human may have felt more permeable than it does to many of us now. Predator and prey, ancestor and spirit, dream and event, stone and body, all may have belonged to a dense symbolic field. The animal carvings at Göbekli Tepe suggest not decorative whim, but a mentality in which creatures were charged with power, danger, and meaning. These people observed animals constantly, depended on them, feared them, and perhaps imagined themselves in relation to them in ways we can only partly recover. Answerless as drift to ponder, we are left with the outline of communities both practical and visionary. They knew how to butcher a gazelle, shape a blade, find water, and read seasons. They also knew how to gather around symbols, how to invest labour in places not reducible to mere shelter, how to transform a ridge into a centre of social gravity. Their mobility did not prevent complexity. It may have enabled a different kind of complexity, one based not on walls and bureaucracy, but on recurring assembly and remembered space. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. What already seems clear is that the people of Göbekli Tepe were neither primitive caricatures nor anonymous shadows stumbling toward history. They were accomplished human beings at the edge of a transforming world. Their lives were mobile but not aimless, communal but not simple, materially grounded but open to powerful symbolic expression. On the limestone plateau they brought with them the knowledge of hunters, gatherers, tool makers, storytellers, and ritual participants. In doing so, they left behind one of the earliest great signs that human society could become monumental long before it became urban. If Göbekli Tepe astonishes because of its age, It astonishes just as much because of the sheer physical act of making it. It is one thing to imagine early communities gathering on a hill for ritual. It is another to imagine them cutting immense blocks from limestone bedrock, shaping them into towering T-forms, hauling them into position, and setting them upright with such confidence that the arrangement still carries architectural force after 11,000 years. This was not symbolic life in the abstract. It was symbolic life translated into labour, coordination, and stone on a scale that forces us to ask one of the oldest archaeological questions with renewed seriousness. How exactly did they do it? The first answer lies underfoot. Göbekli Tepe was not built in a landscape devoid of usable material. The hill itself is limestone, and that matters enormously. The builders were not dragging every monolith from remote quarries across impossible distances. In many cases, they were working directly with the bedrock of the ridge. Quarry zones identified near the excavated enclosures show that blocks could be detached from the living stone close to where they would ultimately stand. This did not make the task easy, it made it possible. Limestone yields reluctantly but predictably. With flint tools, hammerstones, wedges, and patient skill, the builders could score channels, isolate masses, and gradually separate great slabs from the parent rock. It was slow work. There was no metal blade to bite quickly into the stone, no machine to absorb the burden of repetition. Every cut was earned, every fracture had to be anticipated. A mistake could waste weeks of effort or ruin a carefully selected block. The people who did this were not casual labourers improvising with brute force alone. They understood stone behaviour intimately. Quarrying requires foresight. It requires seeing the shape hidden inside the rock before it exists. Once detached, the pillars had to be refined. Some were monumental in scale, several metres high and weighing many tons. Their T-shaped form was not incidental. The vertical shaft and broad head had to be proportioned, balanced, and smoothed enough to function visually and structurally. Relief carvings then transformed many surfaces into active fields of meaning. This means the work was not divided simply between builders and artists in the modern sense. Construction and image-making were joined. A pillar was both mass and message. It had to stand, but it also had to signify. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. No preserved manual explains the exact techniques used to move these stones. We do not have ropes, sledges, or lifting frames preserved in the archaeological record in a form that resolves the question fully. Yet experimental reasoning allows plausible reconstruction. Wooden rollers may have been used in limited contexts, though suitable timber would have been a resource to manage carefully. More likely, sledges, dragging systems, lubrication with water or mud, earthen ramps, and coordinated teams of people provided the main force. A heavy stone does not need a miracle to move. It needs planning, leverage, and many hands acting together with discipline. That last part may be the most important. Monumental construction is not only a technical achievement, it is a social achievement. To move a multi-ton pillar uphill or across uneven ground, a community must agree on the effort. People must arrive when needed. They must accept direction. They must coordinate exertion. They must feed one another during the process. Injuries and delays must be managed. Work must be resumed after interruption. Songs may have helped regulate pulling. Commands may have been shouted. Ritual may have sanctified the labour itself, turning strain into devotion. A monument is never just stone. It is organised belief made visible. Imagine the scene. The block has been cut free. Ropes of twisted fibre or hide are secured. The stone rests on a prepared base, perhaps on timbers, perhaps on a drag platform. Men and women gather around, though the exact division of labour remains unknown. Children watch from a distance, learning what their elders can do together. Dust rises. Feet dig into the earth. The first attempt barely shifts the mass. Adjustments are made. The route is cleared. More people are called. Then slowly, with groaning friction and shouted rhythm, the stone begins to move, not elegantly, not quickly, but undeniably. Human will converts landscape into architecture one strained body at a time, and movement was only part of the challenge. Erection was harder still. To raise a pillar upright, the builders needed prepared foundation sockets. carefully judged balance, and probably mounds or ramps of earth to control the tilt and descent into place. The base had to fit securely. The stone could not simply be dropped into position without risking fracture or collapse. This implies a practical understanding of the weight distribution, angle, and support, not mathematics in the written formal sense, but embodied engineering. The builders had to know how things stood and why they fell. Their knowledge was learned in action, stored in hands and habits rather than diagrams. The enclosures themselves testify to this competence. Pillars were not scattered randomly. They were integrated into walls and arranged around central monoliths with deliberate spatial order. Some spaces feel almost theatrical in their geometry, as if movement within them had been anticipated. Architecture at Göbekli Tepe was not the accidental byproduct of piling stone. It was spatial composition. The builders were shaping not just structures, but experiences. They were deciding where people would stand, what they would face, how the central stones would dominate the eye, and how enclosure itself would alter the emotional texture of gathering. That requires a different kind of imagination. It is not enough to carve a block if one cannot envision the finished space. Someone, or some group, had to hold the larger plan in mind. They had to understand sequence. Quarry first, transport next. Socket preparation, standing, walling, surface treatment. Perhaps carving at different stages, perhaps ceremony at the moment of raising. This suggests leadership of some kind, though not necessarily rigid centralized command. Skilled coordinators, master builders, or ritual authorities may have guided the process. In many traditional societies, technical mastery and sacred authority are not sharply separated. The person who knows how to set the stone may also know why it must be set, answerless, adrift to ponder. We are left facing the possibility that labour at Göbekli Tepe was itself ceremonial. Not merely work in service of ritual, but ritual enacted through work. The quarrying, hauling, carving, and raising of pillars may have bound communities together through repeated acts of disciplined cooperation. To help lift a monolith into place was to participate in something larger than subsistence. It was to help create a centre that would outlast the individual life. That kind of labour changes the people who perform it. It teaches hierarchy or solidarity or both. It creates memory in the muscles as well as in the mind. There is also the question of scale beyond what has been excavated. Geophysical surveys suggest additional buried enclosures, meaning the effort represented by the visible architecture may be only part of the total undertaking. If so, then the cumulative labour investment was immense. Göbekli Tepe was not a single burst of construction. It was sustained monumental activity over generations. One set of builders may have begun what their descendants continued, modified, and eventually buried. In that sense, the hill was not just worked. It was inhabited by a long project, one that kept drawing human energy towards stone. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. But even now, the conclusion is difficult to escape. The builders of Göbekli Tepe possessed engineering intelligence, social cohesion, and technical patience at a level once denied to communities of their age. They did not need bronze chisels or wheeled carts to make something grand. They needed bedrock, tools of stone, practiced hands, and a reason powerful enough to gather effort across many bodies and many seasons. And that reason, whatever precise form it took, was strong enough to turn a limestone hill into one of the earliest monumental landscapes on Earth. At the heart of Göbekli Tepe stands one of its most arresting mysteries, the shape of the pillars themselves. If they were only supports, the sight would already be remarkable. But they do not feel like supports. They feel present. They rise with an austere, almost bodily stillness, especially the great central monoliths that dominate several of the enclosures. Their form is simple at first glance, a vertical shaft capped by a broad horizontal head, creating the famous T-shape. Yet the longer one studies them, the less abstract they seem. Some carry carved arms running down the sides. Some show hands meeting across the front, belts, loincloth-like details, and carefully placed surface features give the strong impression that these are not merely stones arranged for architecture. They are stylized beings. That recognition changes everything. A building support bears weight. A being bears meaning. If the pillars are anthropomorphic, then the enclosures are not only spaces constructed by humans, they are spaces populated by monumental presences. The circles become assemblies. The central monoliths become figures confronting one another or standing in silent relation. The smaller pillars around the perimeter may echo, attend, or frame this encounter. What at first appears to be architecture alone begins to resemble a gathering of entities larger than ordinary life. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know who or what these beings were understood to be. Gods, ancestors, spirits, guardians, mythical founders, personified forces of nature, or something outside all these later categories remain possible in varying degrees. The temptation to name them too quickly should be resisted. Literate civilizations leave texts that let us test our guesses against actual mythic systems. Göbekli Tepe leaves no such written key. We are confronted instead with form, placement, and pattern. Interpretation must remain careful. Though the anthropomorphic signal is hard to ignore, the T-shape itself may have carried significance beyond the simple outline of a body. The broad head section has no carved face. This absence is striking. Later human representation often emphasizes the face as the seat of identity. Here, identity is suggested without portraiture. A body is present, but individuality is withheld. That may mean the pillars were not intended as depictions of specific persons in a realistic sense. They may have represented types of being, sacred roles, or generalized presences beyond ordinary human individuality. Their power lies partly in this restraint. They are human enough to feel animate, but impersonal enough to feel otherworldly. Imagine entering one of the enclosures when it was active. The walls hold the space. The ground has been prepared. Around you stand pillars, each upright and mute, yet charged by their very stillness. At the centre loom two larger forms, taller and more commanding, perhaps catching first light or evening shadow across their flat surfaces. They do not gaze in the literal sense, for no eyes are carved, yet one would almost certainly feel watched. The effect may have been deliberate. Human beings are exquisitely sensitive to bodily presence. A vertical form with shoulders, arms, and hands can trigger the sense of another being even without a face. Göbekli Tepe may have used that perception with extraordinary sophistication. This has profound implications for how sacred space worked here. If the enclosures were occupied symbolically by monumental beings, then ritual at the site may have unfolded not in front of images, but among presences. Participants may have moved inside a controlled environment, where stone figures embodied powers not available in ordinary life. The central pillars in particular suggest rank or heightened significance. They may have represented twin powers, paired ancestors, divine counterparts, or a polarity now lost to us. Their scale sets them apart. The surrounding pillars, though often impressive, feel like a supporting order around the central pair. This spatial hierarchy hints that the enclosure was structured as a field of relationships rather than a neutral building. The carvings reinforce that impression. Arms and hands are not necessary on a mere structural post. Their inclusion signals body. Belts and garments suggest social or ritual status. These are subtle details, but subtlety does not diminish intentionality. Quite the opposite. It suggests that the makers were thinking carefully about how to transform stone into presence with the minimum required signs. The result is powerful precisely because it is pared down. Göbekli Tepe does not overwhelm with anatomical detail. It evokes a being through selected essentials, allowing the human mind to complete what the carving only begins, answerless, adrift to ponder. We're drawn toward another possibility as well. Perhaps these pillars marked a threshold in the human imagination, a moment when symbolic representation became monumental without yet becoming narrative in the written sense. In later civilizations, gods are named, storied, genealogized, and depicted in elaborate iconography. Here we may be seeing an earlier sacred grammar, one that works through stance, enclosure, repetition, and bodily sign rather than through text. The pillars may have spoken through arrangement and atmosphere rather than through explicit mythology. Their meaning may have been performed, remembered, and felt more than verbally explained. That does not make the system primitive. It may in fact make it more demanding. A non-literate symbolic world depends on memory, participation, and embodied experience. Meaning is carried by ritual action, not merely by reading. The pillars would then function as anchors of collective memory, to stand among them, to hear words spoken there, to witness offerings, dances, feasts, or initiations, would be to learn what the place meant through repetition. Stone does not have to explain itself if a community already knows how to approach it. There is also a social dimension. Monumental anthropomorphic pillars suggest that the builders were thinking seriously about personhood, authority, and the relation between humans and higher powers. To carve arms and hands onto a pillar is to say that stone can hold agency in symbolic form. It is to blur the boundary between person and monument, in a world where ancestors, animals, and invisible forces may all have been active participants in life. This blurring makes sense. The pillars are not portraits because they do not need to be. They are bodies sufficient for sacred presence. Some scholars have proposed that the T-shaped monoliths represent human figures in highly stylized fashion, and the evidence strongly supports that general direction. Yet even here caution matters. Representation is not identity. To say the pillars are anthropomorphic is not to say we fully understand what category of being they expressed. A sacred ancestor is not the same as a god. A culture hero is not the same as a dead chief. A spirit embodied in stone is not the same as a human being memorialized. Göbekli Tepe keeps these distinctions frustratingly out of reach. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. More buried enclosures, new carvings, or associated sites may someday clarify the symbolic order. For now, what can be said is already astonishing. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe were almost certainly conceived as more than engineering components. Their form, detail, and placement indicate a world in which stone bodies stood at the centre of communal meaning. They transformed empty hilltop space into an inhabited sacred field. They gave shape to presences that mattered enough for people to quarry, carve, raise, and eventually bury with deliberate care. In that sense, the language of pillars may be one of the oldest monumental languages humanity ever created. Not written in signs on clay, not spoken across surviving texts, but standing, silent, and immense beneath the Anatolian sky. If the pillars of Göbekli Tepe are its silent bodies, then the animals carved upon them are its restless pulse. They move across the stone with a force that feels anything but decorative. Foxes stride low and taut. Serpents twist in concentrated lines. Boars appear heavy with danger. Birds spread wings or stand with a severe alertness that resists any easy softness. These are not the gentle companions of a domesticated world. They belong to a landscape still alive with risk, hunger, speed, carrion, venom, tusk, claw, and sudden violence. The artistic program of Göbekli Tepe does not soothe the eye. It sharpens it. This is important because sacred art often reveals not only what a people admired, but what they feared. The men and women who gathered on this hill did not live apart from animals. They lived among them, by them, against them, and through them. Wild creatures provided meat, hide, bone, danger, and signs. To see an animal clearly in such a world was not a sentimental act. It was a practical necessity, and perhaps also a spiritual one. A fox was never just a fox. A vulture was never just a bird. A serpent was never just a line in the grass. Each creature occupied a place in human thought shaped by repeated encounters, by successful hunts, by wounds, by scavenged remains, by sudden appearances at dusk or dawn, by dreams, and by the peculiar moral charge that comes from sharing a world with beings neither human nor inert. At Göbekli Tepe, these animals are not shown in crowded narrative scenes. They are often singular, emblematic, almost heraldic in their isolation. This gives them unusual intensity. A lone fox running across a pillar does not merely describe a species, it announces presence. A snake carved in relief does not simply record that snakes existed, it makes their coiling danger permanent. The animal becomes sign, and the sign becomes part of the architecture of feeling. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know the exact symbolic code behind each creature. No inscription tells us whether the fox represented cunning, the boar aggression, the vulture death, or whether such categories are already too shaped by later habits of interpretation. Yet pattern matters. Certain animals recur. Predators and threatening beings appear prominently. This suggests that the symbolic world of Göbekli Tepe was not built only around fertility, abundance, or the calm generosity of nature. It was built around tension. The sacred here may have involved confrontation with dangerous forces rather than escape from them. That possibility gives the site a darker texture than many later temple traditions. One does not get the sense of a domesticated sanctuary filled only with order and blessing. One gets the sense of a place where order had to be negotiated against a surrounding field of peril. The carvings may have marked powers that needed respect, appeasement, imitation, or ritual control. They may have served as warnings, invocations, clan emblems, or mnemonic devices connected to stories now lost. Whatever the specific system, the emotional atmosphere they create is unmistakable. This was a sacred world charged with sharp edges. The vulture imagery is especially striking. In many early symbolic systems, birds that feed on the dead occupy an uneasy position between horror and transcendence. They are creatures of decay, yet also of sky. They descend upon death, yet rise above the earth. In parts of the broader Neolithic Near East, human remains, skull treatment, and mortuary ritual suggest that death was not hidden away as a purely private event. It was social, visible, and transformative. If vultures at Göbekli Tepe were tied to mortuary symbolism, then their appearance may point toward beliefs about exposure, transition, or the movement of the dead between worlds. But caution remains necessary. The symbolism may have been more layered than any one function. Serpents, too, demand attention. Their bodies are ideal for relief carving, but their frequent appearance is unlikely to be an aesthetic convenience alone. Snakes are among the most enduring sacred animals in human history because they are simultaneously intimate and uncanny. They move without limbs. They appear and vanish. Some kill with a hidden strike. Others shed their skins, making visible a kind of renewal that human beings could only envy. In the stone language of Göbekli Tepe, serpents may have embodied danger, transformation, boundary crossing, or all three. Their repeated presence suggests that the builders considered them symbolically potent enough to belong near the heart of communal ritual space. Then there are the boars, thick-bodied and formidable, creatures that would have inspired respect from anyone familiar with the violence of a cornered wild animal. Boars are not merely edible, they are unpredictable and forceful. To carve them is to acknowledge a power that exists outside human control. Foxes, on the other hand, occupy a different emotional register, more elusive, more watchful. They seem to hover between the ordinary and the uncanny. Their prominence at Göbekli Tepe has often been noted because they appear so insistently. Whether they carried mythic significance, social association, or some now vanished ritual meaning, their recurrence suggests deliberate emphasis rather than casual naturalism, answerless, adrift to ponder. We may consider another possibility. The animal carvings could reflect not a random catalogue of the surrounding ecosystem, but a curated symbolic field in which certain creatures stood for zones of reality: sky, earth, carrion, predation, stealth, danger, virility, death, transition. A sacred enclosure populated by such signs would become a compressed image of the world itself. Not the whole world in every detail, but the world as it mattered most to ritual thought. Participants entering such a space would move among concentrated forms of power. The carvings would not simply decorate the pillars, they would define the emotional and cosmological atmosphere of the enclosure. This helps explain why the art feels so mature. There is little excess. The reliefs are economical but controlled. They are not crude attempts at depiction by people just discovering representation. They reflect a tradition of looking closely at animals and distilling them into recognizable and meaningful forms. The sculptors knew how to suggest posture, motion, and threat with disciplined restraint. In that sense, the carvings are both aesthetic and intellectual acts. They show that the builders did not merely live with animals, they thought with them. There may also have been a social function to this imagery. Different groups arriving at Göbekli Tepe may have identified with particular creatures through stories, lineages, or ritual roles. Animal symbolism often serves as a bridge between dispersed communities because it is memorable, emotionally powerful, and rooted in a shared experience of the landscape. A fox, a snake, or a vulture can carry layered meanings without requiring writing. If gatherings at the site brought together people from different territories, the carved menagerie may have helped create a common symbolic vocabulary while still preserving distinctions meaningful to those present. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. For now, the animal reliefs remain among the most compelling aspects of Göbekli Tepe, because they draw us into a sacred vision of the world that is not soft, pastoral, or comfortably anthropocentric. It is a world where human beings stand among other powers, some hunted, some feared, some watched with uneasy reverence. The first monumental sanctuary, if sanctuary it was, did not turn away from the dangerous vitality of nature. It brought that vitality into stone and set it around the gathered human body like a ring of signs, and so the animals remain, still moving across the limestone, still tense with old meanings, still reminding us that the earliest sacred imagination may have been shaped not by distance from the wild, but by an intimacy with it so deep that every creature could become a messenger of power. For all its towering pillars and fierce animal imagery, Göbekli Tepe raises a question as basic as it is difficult. What kind of place was this in lived human terms? The temptation is to choose a single word and rest there. Temple, sanctuary, ritual centre, pilgrimage site, gathering ground. But the deeper one looks into early human societies, the less satisfying such neat labels become. Words like temple come from later worlds, from civilizations that wrote prayers, appointed priesthoods, codified offerings, and built sacred architecture within already settled social orders. Göbekli Tepe belongs to a much earlier horizon. Its builders did not leave doctrinal language behind. They left space, stone, bone, and pattern. From these we must infer not a tidy category, but a way of use, and that use may have been multiple. There is little evidence that the excavated monumental enclosures functioned as ordinary domestic housing. Their scale, layout, and iconographic intensity do not resemble the simple grammar of shelter. They were not built as everyday homes in the plainest sense. The great T-shaped monoliths dominate the spaces too strongly. The enclosures feel focused, formal, and charged. They suggest intention beyond sleeping, cooking, and routine family life. Yet this does not mean that daily activity was absent from the hill. Human gatherings, especially repeated seasonal ones, rarely divide life into the modern categories of sacred and ordinary. People arrive, prepare food, repair tools, rest, speak, argue, laugh, mourn, and perform ritual in overlapping rhythms. A place can be exceptional without being cut off from the practical realities of bodies. This is where the evidence of feasting becomes so important. Faunal remains from Göbekli Tepe indicate the large-scale consumption of wild animals, especially gazelle among others. Such accumulation suggests not merely subsistence in the narrow sense, but events. Food on this scale implies coordinated procurement, preparation, and sharing. A great gathering does not sustain itself on symbolism alone. People must eat, and the act of feeding many people is itself socially powerful. Feasting creates obligation. It reinforces alliance. It marks occasion. It transforms time from ordinary sequence into memorable event. The hill, then, may have been a place where people did not simply visit in passing, but came together in significant numbers to participate in something collective and heightened. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. Were these gatherings annual seasonal linked to migration cycles, burial practices, initiations, or the availability of particular resources? The archaeology does not yet let us answer with confidence. But one can reasonably imagine a rhythm of return. Communities dispersed across the wider landscape may have converged at certain times, drawn by necessity, tradition, or ritual duty. The hill would then function less like a permanently inhabited settlement, and more like a ceremonial node, a place activated by periodic concentration of people and labour. That model has great explanatory power. Mobile groups can accomplish astonishing things when aggregation happens predictably. They bring skills, stories, marriage ties, tensions, and memory into one place. They can quarry, carve, build, and feast together in ways impossible for a single small band acting alone. In that sense, Göbekli Tepe may have been a social engine as much as a sacred one. It gathered scattered lives into temporary density. It turned movement into assembly. It converted dispersed knowledge into collective action. Yet even that may not be enough. The architecture suggests more than a useful rendezvous point. The monumental enclosures have a deliberate internal drama. Central pillars dominate. Peripheral stones frame. Animal imagery surrounds. The experience of entering such a space must have differed sharply from standing in an ordinary camp. This implies that gatherings here were not just large, they were orchestrated. Participants may have moved through stages of activity, from open areas of arrival and preparation into increasingly formal spaces where selected rites occurred. Some people may have had access to certain enclosures while others observed from beyond. Procession, initiation, oath-making, mourning, instruction, and display are all conceivable within such a setting. The very act of gathering may have had cosmological meaning. To assemble on the hill was perhaps not merely to meet other people, but to enter an ordered relationship with powers represented in stone. The carved pillars may have stood as presences before whom community was renewed. A feast in such a place would not be just a meal. It would be an offering of human cooperation before dangerous and sacred forces. A shared hunt brought to the hill and consumed there might join economy and cosmology in one gesture. The world of Göbekli Tepe may not have recognized our distinction between practical event and ritual event. Every important action could carry symbolic weight. There is another possibility that must be taken seriously. The hill may have been part of a wider ceremonial landscape rather than a single isolated centre. Other contemporaneous and near-contemporaneous sites in the region suggest that Upper Mesopotamia contained multiple places where communal architecture and symbolic activity were developing. Göbekli Tepe may have been unusually monumental, but not wholly alone in spirit. If so, then those who came here were participating in a broader cultural horizon in which special places anchored regional identity. The hill would then serve not just one community, but many, and perhaps also stand in subtle relation to neighbouring sacred sites. Answerless, adrift to ponder, we might picture a season of gathering at its height. Smoke rises from fires outside the most formal spaces. Meat is being cut and roasted. Stoneworkers chip at tools or smooth surfaces. Children run at the edges of adult attention. Elders speak in low tones. Somewhere songs begin. Somewhere a line of people moves toward an enclosure whose central monoliths catch the changing light. Some enter, some wait. Some watch in awe because they have seen this before. Others feel it for the first time and understand that this hill is not like other hills. It is a place where the world is arranged differently. Such scenes are speculative, but they remain grounded in the evidence that Göbekli Tepe was made for assembly, not solitude. Its architecture implies audience, movement, and attention. Its faunal remains imply food on a notable scale. Its symbolic program implies shared meanings powerful enough to justify repeated labour. This does not prove a single function. It reveals a convergence of functions: sacred place, social theatre, memory centre, feast ground, labour project, regional anchor. The hill may have been all of these at once. That complexity is precisely what makes it so important for understanding early human society. It suggests that communal life could become organised around special places before the full rise of village agriculture and state structures. The social imagination did not need cities in order to create centres. It only needed people willing to return, to remember, and to bind themselves through shared acts carried out in significant space. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. Future excavation may reveal more about activity areas around the monumental core, about food processing, temporary occupation, or patterns of access. But already the hill tells us something profound. Göbekli Tepe was not simply built and admired, it was used. It gathered bodies as well as beliefs. It turned landscape into occasion. It offered a stage on which community could become visible to itself beneath the gaze of stone beings and carved animals, and in that visibility, human life may have crossed a threshold. Not yet into city life, not yet into kingship, but into a new kind of collective existence, where people came together not only because they had to survive, but because there were places that taught them what surviving together might mean. Few ideas in early human history are as unsettling or as exciting as the possibility that ritual did not follow agriculture, but helped make it necessary. For generations, the standard explanation seemed straightforward. People learned to cultivate plants and manage food production more reliably. This led to surplus. Surplus allowed larger settled communities. Settled communities generated specialization, hierarchy, priesthoods, and eventually temples. In that story, religion appears as a consequence of material success, a structure laid on top of stability. Once the difficult work of feeding people had already been solved, it is a powerful model because it feels logical. First bread, then belief. First field, then shrine. Göbekli Tepe has forced scholars to consider whether the order might sometimes have been closer to the reverse. Here we find monumental ritual architecture at a date so early that full agricultural village life had not yet fully matured in the familiar sense. The people who raised these pillars were living in a landscape rich with wild resources, but they were not yet peasants tied to fully domesticated fields and herds, and yet they built a place that required repeated cooperation, large labour inputs, and substantial provisioning. That fact opens a radical possibility. What if the desire or obligation to gather at places like this intensified the pressures that eventually led to cultivation? What if ritual aggregation came first, and agriculture accelerated because such aggregation demanded a more dependable food base? It is a dangerous idea only because it overturns comforting sequences. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. No single trench at Göbekli Tepe can prove that religion invented farming. Human transformation is never that simple. Yet the site makes it increasingly difficult to imagine early ceremonial life as a minor side effect of subsistence. The architecture is too ambitious. The labour investment is too large. The communal scale implied by the enclosures and associated feasting is too significant. This was not a small symbolic flourish added to an otherwise ordinary mobile existence. It was a major social undertaking. Major undertakings create demands. People must be fed. Time must be coordinated. Labour must be mobilized repeatedly. In the long run, those pressures may favour experimentation with more predictable plant use and, eventually, cultivation. Imagine the practical problem. A group of hunter-gatherers can feed itself through mobility and intimate ecological knowledge. A much larger seasonal aggregation is another matter. If many people gather on a hill for ceremonial construction, ritual, and feasting, then the burden on surrounding resources intensifies. Hunting alone may not always provide sufficient predictability, especially if gatherings become regular or competitive in scale. Wild cereals gathered from the landscape might begin as supplemental foods, then become increasingly central because they can be harvested in quantity, processed, and perhaps managed more intentionally. The sacred event, in other words, may create logistical pressures that favour a new relationship with plants. This idea does not require theology in the later doctrinal sense. It only requires that ritual gatherings matter enough to organise repeated human effort. Once that condition exists, the line between social obligation and economic innovation becomes thin. A feast held once is an event. A feast expected again next season becomes planning. Planning leads to attention. Attention leads to manipulation. Manipulation leads, slowly and unevenly, toward domestication. Not because anyone invented agriculture in a single flash of insight, but because the social world began asking more of the landscape than older mobility patterns could comfortably sustain. That possibility is especially compelling in the northern Fertile Crescent, where wild progenitors of later domesticated cereals were already present. The people of this region did not need to imagine plants from nothing. They were already harvesting, sorting, grinding, and consuming useful grasses and seeds. The shift from gathering to cultivation was not a leap across an abyss. It was a gradual tightening of human attention around certain species. If ritual centres like Göbekli Tepe intensified the need for reliable bulk foods, then they may have served as social catalysts for that tightening. Answerless, adrift to ponder, we must also consider another dimension. Ritual does not simply require food, it creates identity. A community that builds together begins to think of itself differently. It remembers shared effort. It distinguishes insiders from outsiders. It marks place. Such processes encourage permanence in memory before permanence in architecture becomes domestic. Once people begin investing emotionally in a recurring centre, the landscape around that centre changes in significance. Nearby resources matter more. Routes become habitual. Seasonal return becomes expectation. The idea of staying longer, tending more carefully, storing more deliberately, or planting opportunistically may emerge not merely from hunger, but from attachment. That may be one of Göbekli Tepe's deepest lessons. Human beings do not transform their world only because they need more calories. They transform it because meaning changes how they organize labor. A hill becomes sacred. Sacredness requires return. Return requires provisioning. Provisioning rewards experimentation. Experimentation reshapes the relationship between humans and wild species. In that chain, belief is not an ornament. It is an active force in economic history. Of course, caution is necessary. Some scholars argue that the distinction between ritual centre and settlement may be overstated, or that early cultivation and symbolic elaboration were developing together in a more entangled way than a simple reversal suggests. That is a fair warning. Göbekli Tepe should not be turned into a slogan. The true process was likely messy, regional, and prolonged. Different communities may have moved toward cultivation for different reasons, with ritual, environment, demography, and opportunity all interacting over centuries. Yet even with that caution, the site has already achieved something extraordinary. It has broken the old certainty that religion must wait politely until material life has advanced enough to support it. The evidence suggests something much more human and much more interesting. People may have come together first around symbols powerful enough to justify difficult cooperation. The resulting gatherings then created pressures and possibilities that encouraged new subsistence strategies. The sacred and the economic, so often divided in modern thought, may have been intertwined from the start. The first monumental places were not standing at the end of a developmental ladder. They may have been helping to build the ladder as people climbed it. There is also a psychological truth here. Collective ritual allows human beings to do things they would not do alone. It converts private fear into shared action. It gives hardship meaning. It turns labor into offering, waiting into expectation, memory into obligation. Such forces are not secondary in history. They are among its great engines. If Göbekli Tepe reveals a world in which people gathered before they settled fully, then perhaps it also reveals that the desire to belong to something larger than the individual household was among the earliest powers shaping civilization. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. Archaeobotanical evidence, residue studies, and continued excavation across the region may refine or complicate this picture, but the question will not disappear. Did ritual precede agriculture in social importance? Did gathering for the sacred help drive the management of plants? Göbekli Tepe does not answer with perfect clarity, yet it asks with unforgettable force, and perhaps that is enough, because once the question is asked seriously, the ancient world shifts. The first farmers no longer appear simply as practical innovators solving hunger. They also appear as descendants of communities already drawn together by memory, image, obligation, and awe. Before the field was fenced, the hill may have been marked. Before the granary filled, the stones may have risen. Before civilization fed itself securely, it may have learned first how to gather around meanings that felt larger than survival alone. If Göbekli Tepe stands near the dawn of monumental ritual, it also stands near another threshold just as profound: the slow turning of wild plants into human companions. This transformation did not happen in a single season, nor under a single insight. No one woke one morning and invented agriculture. The process was slower, quieter, and far more intimate than that. It began with attention, repeated harvesting, repeated return to favoured stands, the observation that some grasses were more useful than others, that some seeds held fast while others shattered too easily, that certain valleys produced more dependable growth, that timing mattered, soil mattered, weather mattered. Over generations, these small acts of noticing accumulated. Human beings began to shape the plant world not all at once, but through repeated contact so persistent that the plants themselves eventually changed. Göbekli Tepe lies close to the heart of that story. The surrounding regions of southeastern Anatolia and the northern Fertile Crescent contain the wild ancestors of important early cereals, including einkorn wheat and related grasses that would later become foundational to agricultural life. This is not a trivial coincidence. The people who gathered on the limestone ridge lived in proximity to landscapes already rich in potential. They did not need to import the botanical basis of agriculture from some distant civilizational core. It was around them in wild form, woven into the ecology they knew intimately. They harvested from it long before full domestication had taken hold. Archaeobotany, though often quieter in popular imagination than towering pillars and carved animals, is one of the great keys to this world. Through charred seeds, plant remains, microscopic residues, and the distribution of species across early sites, scholars can begin to reconstruct how ancient communities interacted with vegetation. What emerges from the broader region is not a sudden agricultural revolution, but a prolonged entanglement between people and useful plants. At first, as wild cereals were gathered opportunistically or seasonally. Then, in some places, that gathering seems to have intensified. Selection pressures followed. Plants that responded well to repeated human harvesting and localized disturbance gained advantage. Over long spans of time, truly wild populations gave way to forms increasingly shaped by human activity. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. Göbekli Tepe itself has not yielded a simple final answer to whether its builders were already farming in a developed sense. The evidence points instead to a threshold condition. They lived close to wild resources and likely exploited them heavily. They were not fully detached from cultivation like some older romantic image of pure hunters wandering untouched by plant management. Nor were they yet classic village farmers in the later settled mould. They belonged to the in-between, that long and creative middle ground where gathering, tending, returning, selecting, and perhaps sowing were beginning to merge into something new. That middle ground may be the most important place in human history. We often speak of domestication as though it were a technical achievement, like the invention of a tool. But domestication is also a relationship. It changes both sides. Plants become more dependent on human sowing and protection. Humans become more dependent on predictable harvests, seasonal labour, and eventually the social arrangements required to defend, store, and distribute crops. Once that process deepens, life changes at every level. Mobility narrows, property intensifies, time itself becomes more structured. But at the beginning, before those consequences fully hardened, domestication was subtle. It may have felt less like a revolution, and more like a habit deepening around favoured landscapes. That is why Göbekli Tepe matters so much. The site suggests that one of the pressures pushing this deepening may have come from communal gathering and ritual life. If people returned repeatedly to a sacred ridge, and if those returns required food at scale, then nearby stands of grain would become more significant with each cycle. Harvesting them efficiently would matter more. Perhaps protecting them informally would matter more. Perhaps experimenting with sowing in convenient areas would begin to seem worthwhile. The sacred centre and the seed field would then enter a quiet alliance, each encouraging the other without either one yet fully becoming the later world of temple economies and agricultural states. Genomic data from wheat has also played a striking role in this broader discussion. Studies of domesticated einkorn point towards southeastern Turkey as a crucial zone in the ancestry of early cultivated wheat. The exact pathways remain debated and complex, but the region's importance is clear. This means the land around Göbekli Tepe was not merely adjacent to the agricultural transition. It was one of its live laboratories. Human communities here were part of the very population network within which the future of cultivation was being tested. The first temple, if temple it was, stood within walking distance of one of humanity's greatest botanical experiments. Imagine the people who gathered there in late season. The grass heads have ripened, hands move through them with practiced speed, stalks are cut or plucked, seeds are collected in baskets or skins, children help, Elders supervise. Some patches are remembered as especially good. Some slopes are watched from year to year. The work is repetitive, but repetition breeds insight. People begin to notice where grain grows thickest after disturbance. They notice what happens where seed spills. They notice what can be encouraged. No written theory is needed. Knowledge grows through return, and return is precisely what places like Göbekli Tepe seem to have demanded. Answerless, adrift to ponder. We might ask whether the first cultivation was less an invention than an accommodation to sacred geography. A people who gathered for ritual needed reliable food nearby. A people who repeatedly harvested useful grasses near a gathering place would begin shaping those grasses over generations. Convenience becomes practice, practice becomes tradition, and tradition begins to alter biology itself. The seed is no longer fully wild because human society has entered its life cycle. There is a paradox here worth lingering over. Agriculture is often imagined as the triumph of practicality over mystery. Yet at Göbekli Tepe, the origins of cultivation may have been entangled with one of the most mysterious sights on Earth. The field and the shrine, so distinct in later historical societies, may have grown up together. Sacred obligation could help create economic discipline. Economic discipline could sustain sacred gathering. This would mean that the roots of farming are not merely material, but social and symbolic. The first harvests may owe as much to memory and ritual return as to hunger alone. This does not diminish human intelligence, it magnifies it. The people of this age were experimenting on multiple fronts at once, even if they would never have separated those fronts conceptually. They were shaping stone into monuments, shaping gatherings into institutions, and shaping plant ecologies into more dependable forms. None of these processes happened in isolation. They fed one another. A hill full of pillars needed food. Food gathered in quantity required planning. Planning encouraged staying power. Staying power reoriented the relationship to land. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the old mobile world bent towards something more rooted. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. New plant remains, residue studies, and regional excavations may refine the timing and character of these changes. But even now the broader picture is deeply suggestive. Göbekli Tepe was built by people standing on the edge of domestication, not as passive observers of that shift, but as active participants in the landscapes where it was unfolding. Their sacred centre rose among the wild ancestors of future crops. Their gatherings may have intensified the need for dependable harvesting. Their habits of return may have helped tame the grain even as the grain began, slowly, to tame them. And so the story of the first pillars becomes inseparable from the story of the first fields, not because one simply replaced the other, but because on the hills and plains of Upper Mesopotamia, stone, seed, memory, and labour were already weaving themselves together into the earliest fabric of civilization. If the fields around Göbekli Tepe speak to the first taming of plants, the human remains and mortuary traces of the wider Neolithic world speak to something even more intimate, the first great efforts to manage memory itself. Death was never simply an ending in early human societies. It was a problem of presence. The dead did not vanish cleanly from the lives of the living. They remained in the mind, in dreams, in places, in obligations, in the uneasy sense that a human being once filled with voice and intention had passed into another condition not easily understood. Long before written theology, people were already making choices about how to treat the dead, how to keep them near or keep them safely transformed, how to bind remembrance to ritual action. Göbekli Tepe, even without yielding a straightforward cemetery in the familiar sense, stands within this broader mortuary horizon, and that horizon matters deeply. Across the pre-pottery Neolithic Near East, evidence has emerged for striking and often unsettling relationships with human remains. Skulls were sometimes removed, curated, plastered, modelled, and displayed. Bodies might be buried beneath floors or in association with domestic and communal spaces. Certain bones were treated differently from others. The dead were not always hidden away in distant silence. In some communities they remained socially active, material participants in the world of the living. These practices suggest that ancestry, remembrance, and identity were already becoming structured through deliberate acts of bodily handling. Göbekli Tepe may belong to that same mental universe. This does not mean we can simply import all mortuary patterns from neighbouring sites and assume they operated identically on the hill. Caution is essential. Yet the symbolic environment of Göbekli Tepe, with its monumental pillars, powerful animal imagery, and severe ritual spaces, seems entirely compatible with a society deeply concerned with the boundary between life and death. Vultures appear in the iconography, and vultures are among the most charged creatures in mortuary imagination. They consume flesh. They hover between earth and sky. They arrive where life has ended and transformation begins. In later interpretation, it has been tempting to see such imagery as evidence of excarnation or sky burial, though definitive proof remains elusive. Even so, the emotional association between carrion birds and death cannot be easily dismissed. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The enclosures at Göbekli Tepe do not provide a simple burial map telling us exactly where the dead were placed, how they were honoured, or whether the central pillars themselves stood in relation to named ancestors. Yet fragments of human remains have been found at the site, and their presence complicates any attempt to treat the hill as a purely abstract ceremonial stage, detached from the bodily realities of mortality. Human bones in ritual contexts are never trivial. Even when incomplete, they suggest that the sacred life of the place may have involved actual encounters with death, remembrance, or transformation. The plastered skull tradition seen at other Neolithic sites is especially evocative in this regard. At places such as Jericho and elsewhere in the broader region, skulls were removed from bodies and remodelled with plaster to recreate faces or emphasise features. Shells might be used for eyes. The result was not a corpse restored, but a strange intermediary object, part human remnant, part crafted memory. These were not crude acts of disposal. They were acts of reconstruction. The dead were made visible again, but in altered form, as if remembrance required material labour just as monumental architecture did. That tells us something important about the mental world of early settled and settling communities. Memory was becoming objectified. It was being anchored not only in story and ritual, but in things, in skulls, in plaster, in stone, in places repeatedly revisited. Göbekli Tepe, with its monumental bodies of limestone and its repeated use over generations, may represent the same larger shift. Human groups were no longer content to let memory dissolve naturally into the rhythm of seasonal movement. They were building it into the landscape. Imagine an elder who once helped raise a pillar on the hill. Years pass. That person dies. The younger generation returns to the same enclosure. The stone still stands where the elder once stood. The place itself remembers. Whether or not actual remains were present there, the architecture would have acted as a kind of externalized continuity, a material witness to lives now gone. In this way, sacred sites and mortuary practice may have converged. The hill was not only where rituals happened, it may have been where community outlived the individual, where the dead remained socially active through place even when their bodies had changed form, answerless, adrift to ponder. We might ask whether the central pillars themselves carried ancestral resonance. Their anthropomorphic form, their scale, and their faceless dignity could allow them to function as more than divine abstractions. They may have embodied categories of revered beings in which ancestors, founding figures, and sacred presences were not sharply separated. In many non-literate societies, the dead do not become anonymous. They become part of the unseen order that authorises the living. If Göbekli Tepe was a place where communities gathered to renew bonds, it would make sense for the dead, whether represented directly or indirectly, to have played a role in that renewal. This possibility also changes how we think about feasting and assembly. A communal meal held in an enclosure surrounded by powerful symbols and perhaps linked to a remembrance of the dead would not be a casual celebration. It would be an act of continuity. The living would gather not simply with one another, but in the presence of those who had gone before, whether imagined through pillars, invoked through ritual, or materially present through curated remains. Such practices bind communities across time. They create obligation. They stabilize identity. They make the dead into partners of the social order. There is another edge to this story as well. Mortuary practice is often one of the earliest places where hierarchy begins to show itself. Not all dead are treated equally. Some bodies are forgotten, some are transformed into memory objects, some are linked to special places. If Göbekli Tepe participated in such distinctions, then the hill may also have been a setting where certain persons were lifted above the anonymity of ordinary death. Ritual specialists, elders, founders, or exceptional individuals may have been remembered differently, even if evidence remains incomplete. The broader Neolithic pattern warns us not to assume a flat social world with no differentiation in remembrance, and yet the deepest point may be more universal. Göbekli Tepe was built by people who had begun to anchor meaning in durable forms: stone pillars, carved animals, repeated gatherings, possible mortuary association. All of these suggest a profound refusal to let human significance disappear without trace. The dead matter because memory matters. Memory matters because community needs continuity. Continuity matters because in a changing world, where climate shifts, resources fluctuate, and lifeways transform, the past becomes one of the few stable things human beings can hold on to. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. Further excavation may reveal more direct mortuary evidence, more human remains, or stronger connections between Göbekli Tepe and the skull traditions seen elsewhere in the Neolithic Near East. For now, this site remains suggestive rather than conclusive, but suggestion, when grounded in surrounding evidence, can still illuminate. Göbekli Tepe appears less and less like a monument to abstract belief alone. It looks increasingly like a place where the living negotiated their relationship to absence, ancestry, and the stubborn persistence of memory. In that sense, the first great sanctuary may also have been one of the first great theatres of remembrance, a place where the dead were not yet banished to silence, a place where stone stood in for continuity, a place where human beings, standing on the edge of history, were already trying to answer the oldest question of all: how to keep those who are gone from vanishing completely. If Göbekli Tepe compels us to think about ritual, memory, and gathering, it also forces us toward another question, one more delicate and perhaps more unsettling. Did places like this help create the first real inequalities of power? The older image of hunter-gatherer life often swings between two extremes. On one side stands the romantic vision of perfect equality, small bands sharing everything in timeless harmony. On the other stands the harsh caricature of constant struggle, in which dominance alone ruled. Reality was almost certainly more complicated. Mobile societies can be deeply cooperative and still recognize prestige. They can value sharing and still defer to skill. They can resist permanent hierarchy and yet allow certain individuals to wield unusual influence at particular moments. Göbekli Tepe seems to belong to exactly such a world, one in which the seeds of hierarchy may have existed before rigid class systems, kingdoms, or bureaucracies had fully formed. Monumental construction is rarely socially neutral. To quarry pillars, organize labor, coordinate gatherings, and maintain a place of repeated ceremonial gravity requires more than shared enthusiasm. It requires direction. Someone must know how the stones are to be shaped. Someone must decide where they will stand. Someone must preserve the memory of how the enclosures are used, when they are entered, who speaks, who watches, who works, and perhaps who is excluded. These roles need not imply kings in the later historical sense, but they do imply differentiated authority. In such a setting, the ability to persuade, instruct, remember, or sanctify becomes power. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not have written records naming priestly offices or elite lineages at Göbekli Tepe. There is no carved proclamation announcing the rule of a sacred household. Yet hierarchy often begins long before it becomes explicit in text. It begins in repeated patterns of deference. It begins when some people know more than others about ritual procedure. It begins when certain individuals can mobilize labor because others accept their right to lead. It begins when memory itself becomes unevenly distributed, guarded by those who know the songs, the stories, the gestures, or the correct order of acts. A monument does not need a throne room to generate rank. It only needs a community willing to recognize that some persons stand closer to the center than others. Imagine a gathering on the hill at the moment of greatest intensity. Many have arrived from scattered territories. Fires burn outside the most formal spaces. Meat is being prepared. Stone tools flash in the light. But when the time comes to enter the enclosure, not everyone steps forward equally. Certain elders or ritual specialists move first. Certain hands know which offering is placed where. Certain voices begin the words or chants that others follow. Knowledge becomes visible as authority. The person who can guide a community through uncertainty, who can interpret symbols, lead labor, settle disputes, or invoke the dead, becomes more than merely respected. That person becomes necessary. Necessity is one of the roots of hierarchy. There is also the matter of craftsmanship. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe were not produced by chance. They required quarrying skill, lithic control, spatial understanding, and symbolic vision. It is unlikely that every member of every gathering possessed these abilities equally. Some would have been better stoneworkers. Some would have been more experienced planners. Some would have had the ability to turn a block into a being through carving. Specialist knowledge, even in an early and fluid form, thus creates status. The person who can do what others cannot do easily may be honoured, deferred to, and remembered. Over time, that respect can harden into social distinction. Yet hierarchy at this stage may not have looked like later oppression. It may have been temporary, seasonal, or situational. A ritual leader on the hill might not command everyday life in the wider landscape. A master builder might direct the setting of pillars, but not control hunting parties months later in distant valleys. This is why Göbekli Tepe is so fascinating. It may represent a transitional political world, one in which authority had become real and consequential, but had not yet fossilized into permanent institutions. The hill could gather power without yet becoming a state. That alone is historically profound, answerless, adrift to ponder. We might ask whether monumental ritual itself encourages hierarchy by creating visible centers. Once a place becomes sacred, access to that place matters. Once access matters, mediation matters. Someone must interpret the center for the rest. Someone must maintain the traditions that justify its importance. Someone must decide what is proper. In this way, ritual and inequality can grow together almost imperceptibly. Not because sacred life is false, but because sacred life concentrates attention, and concentrated attention attracts social weight. The hill becomes a center. Those closest to the center become different. Feasting may have intensified this process. Large communal meals do not simply affirm unity, they can also display generosity, obligation, and rank. The group or individuals who organize the hunt, distribute food, or sponsor the event gain prestige. The ability to provide for others is one of the oldest pathways to power at Göbekli Tepe, where faunal evidence points towards substantial consumption events. Such dynamics may have been crucial. A feast binds people together, but it also teaches them who gave, who led, who received, and who is remembered afterward. In this sense, as food and monumentality may have worked together to elevate certain actors above the common field, mortuary practice may have pushed in the same direction. If some dead were remembered more intensely, associated more strongly with the sacred center, or embodied more fully in ritual life, then inequality did not end at death. It deepened through memory. Ancestors linked to founding labor, ritual knowledge, or prestigious roles could authorize the living descendants or successors who claimed connection to them. A hill full of monumental symbols could thus become a place where rank was not merely enacted in the present, but rooted in the remembered past. There is another sign of emerging hierarchy in the very scale of collective labor. Not all communities choose to invest enormous effort in non-domestic construction. When they do, the project itself changes social relations. People become accustomed to direction. Work must be scheduled, disputes must be resolved, participation may be expected or morally pressured. A large communal build trains a population in coordination. That does not automatically create domination, but it makes more complex forms of authority thinkable and practicable. Göbekli Tepe may therefore represent not just early hierarchy in symbolic form, but early hierarchy in social habit. And yet we should not rush too far. The site does not reveal palaces, storehouses of tribute, or chained labour forces. The people who built it may still have thought of themselves as members of interdependent communities, rather than subjects of rulers. Hierarchy can be shallow before it becomes deep. It can begin as charisma, seniority, mastery, or sacred knowledge long before it becomes coercive office. That is perhaps the most historically plausible reading here. Göbekli Tepe shows us a society in which differences of influence were likely sharpening, even if the full machinery of inequality had not yet arrived. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. Future excavations may clarify who had access to different spaces, whether certain activities clustered around specific persons, or whether nearby settlements show clearer evidence of rank. For now, what the hill suggests is already enough to alter how we imagine the earlier social transformations. Hierarchy did not suddenly appear with kings and tax collectors. It may have been germinating much earlier, in ritual centres where memory, labour, and symbolic knowledge gathered around particular people and particular acts. So the birth of hierarchy may not have begun in a palace. It may have begun on a windswept ridge, among stone beings and carved animals, where some voices carried farther than others, and some hands knew how to raise the sacred into view. One of the most extraordinary things about Göbekli Tepe is not simply that it was built, but that it was buried. This is the kind of fact that slips past the mind too quickly at first. Ancient monuments are often abandoned. They fall into ruin. Walls collapse. Roofs rot. Sand gathers. Grass takes root. Time does its quiet work. And what was once important becomes broken stone. But Göbekli Tepe does not fit that pattern neatly. Many of its great enclosures were not left exposed to chance alone. They were deliberately backfilled. Stone fragments, rubble, earth, animal bone, and debris were packed into the spaces, covering the monumental architecture until the circles disappeared into the mound. This was not simple neglect. It was an action, and actions of this scale ask for motive. To bury an enclosure that took immense labour to create is to make a profound decision about the fate of sacred space. It means that the people responsible, or their descendants, did not merely drift away and forget the old centre at once. They intervened. They closed it. They transformed it from an active place into a sealed one. In doing so, they preserved it even as they ended its visible life. That combination of concealment and preservation gives Göbekli Tepe a strangely ceremonial afterlife. The architecture was not only built with intention, it seems to have been hidden with intention too. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know why the enclosures were filled. We do not know whether the act was mournful, triumphant, fearful, reverent, practical, or all of these at once. Yet the sheer effort involved suggests that it mattered deeply. To backfill a monumental enclosure requires labour, coordination, and choice. People had to bring material, dump it, compact it, and persist until the space was swallowed. This was no casual dumping of household rubbish into abandoned ruins. The volume of fill alone implies a sustained undertaking. If the builders had once gathered to raise the sacred into view, a later generation gathered to lower it into the earth. That reversal is one of the great emotional pivots in the history of the site. Imagine standing on the ridge at such a moment. The pillars still rise. The carvings still look outward in their mute authority. The central monoliths still dominate the enclosure. People move around them not to celebrate their unveiling, but to begin their disappearance. Loads of stone and soil are carried in. Bones from feasts, broken tools, fragments of worked limestone, and earth itself begin to accumulate. Layer by layer, the sacred space contracts. The lower carvings vanish first, then the bases of the pillars, then the walls. Eventually only the upper sections remain visible. Then those too are gone. What had defined the place is now inside the hill. To modern eyes, this can seem almost tragic, but that may be the wrong emotion. In many traditional societies, closing a sacred space is not an act of desecration. It is an act of transition. A shrine may be retired because its work is done. A ritual cycle may end and require sealing. A holy object may be hidden not because it has lost power, but because its power has become too complete, too dangerous, or no longer appropriate for the changed conditions of the community. Burial can be a form of respect. It can also be a form of containment. Something significant is being put beyond ordinary reach. That possibility matters at Göbekli Tepe because the site was already a place where human beings appear to have invested enormous symbolic weight. If the enclosures were sacred, then their burial may have followed a sacred logic. The fill was not merely obstruction, it may have been closure. A chapter of communal life was ending, and the architecture that embodied it had to be put to rest, much as one might treat a powerful relic or even a revered dead body. In that sense, the mound itself becomes a tomb of meanings, not only of stone, answerless, adrift to ponder. We must also consider more practical explanations. Social worlds change. Perhaps the communities who once gathered there no longer needed the old form of assembly. Perhaps the shift toward more settled life altered how ritual was organized. Smaller rectangular buildings appearing in later levels suggest that the site's use evolved. Architecture changed. The grand circular enclosures of the earlier phase may have become less relevant to new social arrangements. If so, the backfilling may reflect not disaster, but adaptation. The old sacred forms were closed because new ones were emerging. Environmental and economic changes may also have played a role. As plant management deepened and communities became more rooted in local settlements, the logic of large seasonal aggregation on a monumental ridge may have weakened. People with growing commitments to fields, stored food, and more permanent domestic lives might no longer gather in the old way, or with the same frequency. The centre of gravity in human life could shift away from ceremonial hilltops toward villages, households, and smaller local shrines. In such a transition, Göbekli Tepe would not necessarily be abandoned in shame or fear. It might simply become part of an older order that was being respectfully closed. There is another, darker possibility. Sacred systems often carry danger when they lose their social consensus. A place once widely understood can become unsettling if its meanings fragment. Later generations may feel reverence without clarity, obligation without confidence. Under such circumstances, burial becomes a way to resolve tension, hide the old centre, neutralize it, protect the community from misuse or from powers no longer properly interpreted. We cannot prove that such feelings were present at Göbekli Tepe, but the intensity of the site's symbolism makes the idea plausible. Powerful places are not always easiest to leave exposed. What is certain is that the backfilling preserved a remarkable archaeological sequence. Because the enclosures were deliberately filled, they were shielded from erosion and later destruction in ways that open ruins rarely are. The very act that ended their active ritual life protected them for the future. That is one of history's great ironies. The people who buried Göbekli Tepe made possible its rediscovery in extraordinary condition. They did not mean to save it for modern science, of course, but by sealing it they allowed the hill to carry its secret intact across millennia. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. More detailed analysis of fill composition, stratigraphic sequence, and architectural transition may clarify whether different enclosures were buried for different reasons or at different paces. Some may have been filled rapidly, others may have accumulated closure in stages. Each variation could reveal something about the social world in motion around the hill. For now, though, the central truth remains astonishing. Göbekli Tepe was not simply abandoned to weather and chance. It was put away, and that act changes how we understand the people who used it. They were not only builders of sacred space, they were custodians of sacred endings. They knew that some places must be opened, and some must be closed. They knew that architecture could have a life cycle, that a monument could be born, used, transformed, and finally returned to the earth by human hands. In burying the enclosures, they did not erase their own achievement. They completed it in a final gesture of concealment. So the first great sanctuary, if sanctuary it was, did not merely vanish. It was folded back into the hill, hidden, preserved, and entrusted to time until another age would cut into the mound and discover that the old stones had been sleeping there all along. By the time the great enclosures of Göbekli Tepe were being filled and withdrawn from active use, the wider human world around them was changing in ways that would alter the rhythm of life forever. For countless generations, mobility had been the great organizing principle. People moved through landscapes rich in memory, game, water, and season. They gathered when conditions allowed, dispersed when necessity required, and carried their worlds in skill, kinship, and story rather than in fixed walls. But now, across Upper Mesopotamia and neighbouring regions, A new pattern was beginning to take shape. It did not arrive all at once, and it did not erase the old ways in a single dramatic stroke. Yet it was unmistakable. People were staying longer. Buildings were becoming more regular. Settlements were growing more continuous. The landscape was no longer only crossed. It was increasingly occupied. Göbekli Tepe belongs exactly to this turning point. That is why its ending is so revealing. The site did not simply disappear into an empty past. It was overtaken by a transformation in how human beings organized time, labor, and belonging. The ceremonial world of seasonal aggregation was giving way, at least in many places, to the more anchored world of settlement. This did not mean that ritual vanished, quite the opposite. Ritual likely moved into new forms, into houses, village shrines, local traditions, ancestor practices, and smaller communal structures tied more closely to everyday life. The sacred did not die. It changed address. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know how the people associated with Göbekli Tepe themselves described this transition, or whether they saw it as progress, loss, duty, or inevitability. They had no abstract vocabulary for the Neolithic revolution. They knew only that life was becoming differently organized. Seed gathering may have become cultivation. Repeated stays may have become villages. Seasonal gathering at a monumental ridge may have become less central as the household. The field and the storage place grew in importance. Human attention was shifting. What had once drawn people upward to the hill may increasingly have drawn them inward to the settlement. This is one of the great paradoxes of early civilization. The same processes that make communal ritual centers possible can also make them unnecessary in their original form. If cultivation became more reliable, if local communities became more permanent, if identity was increasingly rooted in place-specific settlement rather than broad-ranging mobility, then the need for a large regional gathering point might weaken. Why travel far to maintain shared ceremony when social life is now more concentrated at home? Why invest in giant circular enclosures when smaller and more regular buildings better fit the tempo of settled life? That question may help explain the architectural shift seen at Göbekli Tepe. Later levels at the site include smaller, more rectilinear structures, quite different in mood and layout from the earlier monumental circles. This does not suggest a sudden civilizational replacement by strangers. More likely it suggests evolution. The same broader cultural world was adapting to new needs. Monumentality gave way to forms more compatible with a settled or semi-settled existence. The old sacred theatre of towering monoliths was no longer the only or perhaps even the most useful way to organise communal meaning. Imagine a young person living in this time of transition. Their grandparents may remember journeys to the hill as defining events, times when many groups gathered, feasted, laboured, and stood among the giant pillars. Their parents still know the old stories, still respect the ridge, still understand its gravity. But the young person also knows something new. They know a place where people remain for longer stretches. They know plots of land watched more carefully across seasons. They know buildings that are repaired rather than simply revisited. They know the slow accumulation of tools, stored food, obligations to a more stable local community. For them, the hill is still sacred perhaps, but it is no longer the only centre, answerless, adrift to ponder. We may glimpse here the emotional cost of civilizational transition. Something is gained, certainly. More reliable food, greater local continuity, the beginnings of settled social memory. But something may also be lost. The wide horizon life of movement, the periodic drama of large regional assembly, the sense that sacred space lies at a special remove from ordinary dwelling. All of that may begin to narrow. The village brings intimacy and security. It also brings enclosure, repetition, and a new kind of social pressure. A monumental hilltop gathering centre belongs to a world in which communities are still partly open to the distances between them. As settlement deepened, daily life changed at every scale. Labour became more regular and more seasonal in a new way. Land demanded attention across the year. Harvest cycles structured time. Storage created problems of protection and ownership. Architecture became more domestic in emphasis. The human body itself experienced the shift. Repeated agricultural work would eventually alter posture, injury patterns, diet, and disease exposure. Settled life made population growth easier in some respects, but it also brought crowding, waste accumulation, and fresh vulnerabilities. The transition was not a clean ascent into comfort. It was a trade. Göbekli Tepe sits on the edge of that trade like a monument to the last brilliance of an older social form. Its great enclosures seemed to belong to a world where meaning was concentrated episodically, where communities converged rather than remained continuously dense, where sacred architecture rose before the household had fully become the basic engine of civilization. Once villages began to dominate the human landscape, the logic of such architecture may have seemed less urgent. People no longer needed the same kind of centre because their lives had acquired new centres: hearth, field, wall, granary, lineage. All these were becoming more powerful anchors than before. There is a temptation to frame this as replacement, as though one world simply erased another, but history is more layered than that. Early settled communities carried the memory of mobile ancestors within them, ritual habits, symbolic traditions, ancestor reverence, and animal imagery did not vanish the moment cultivation deepened. They were reworked. Some may have become more local, some may have become more domestic. Some may have been folded into emerging village traditions too ordinary for archaeology to recognize with the same dramatic clarity as stone circles on a hill. The first settlers were not severed from the old world. They were its heirs. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. Perhaps more sites will reveal exactly how this transition unfolded in social and architectural terms. Perhaps we will find intermediate spaces that bridge the gap between monumental gathering centres and fully rooted villages. But even now the outline is compelling. Göbekli Tepe did not end because humanity failed. It ended because humanity changed. The social conditions that made it necessary are meaningful and possible, were slowly being transformed by a new relationship to land, food, and settlement. And that may be the deepest significance of its burial. Not the collapse of civilization, but the passing of one mode of human togetherness into another. The hill was built by people whose world was still organized by movement and grand assembly. It was closed by people increasingly drawn towards settlement and local continuity. Between those two realities lies one of the most decisive transitions our species has ever lived through. So when the great enclosures disappeared beneath fill, they were not simply being hidden from view, they were yielding the future to the village. And in that quiet surrender, on a limestone ridge beneath the Anatolian sky, one human age gave way to the next. As the story of Göbekli Tepe widened, it became increasingly clear that the hill did not stand alone. For a time, it was tempting to imagine the site as a singular eruption, a lone miracle on a ridge, unmatched and almost unrepeatable. That image carried its own dramatic appeal. One extraordinary place, older than expected, appearing from the earth to overturn the familiar narrative of civilization. But archaeology rarely leaves wonders isolated for long. Once one site changes the questions, the landscape around it begins to speak differently. Survey, excavation, and comparison gradually revealed that Göbekli Tepe belonged to something larger, a broader ritual horizon spread across Upper Mesopotamia, a world of communities thinking monumentally before cities and kingdoms had yet taken recognizable form. This wider context matters because it protects the site from being misunderstood as an accident. Human beings do not normally invent entire symbolic systems in complete isolation. If Göbekli Tepe displays mature architectural planning, powerful iconography, and repeated ceremonial labour, then those capacities must have existed in a wider social field. The hill may be one of the grandest surviving expressions of that field, but it was not its only expression. Other sites in the region, though different in scale and detail, suggest that early Neolithic communities were already experimenting with special architecture, communal spaces, and carved symbolism across a considerable area. Göbekli Tepe was a summit, not a solitary spark. Karahan Tepe is among the most striking of these related places. Located in the same broader region of southeastern Anatolia, it has emerged as a site of immense importance in its own right. There too, T-shaped pillars appear. There too, monumental architecture and carefully worked stone point toward a symbolic world larger and more complex than older models once allowed. Some of its sculptural forms feel even more intimate and unsettling, as if the human body and the built environment were being drawn into increasingly close, symbolic conversation. The relationship between Karahan Tepe and Göbekli Tepe is not one of simple duplication. They are not copies of one another, but together they reveal a cultural landscape in which communities shared certain sacred ideas, architectural habits, and ritual ambitions. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not yet know the full chronology and hierarchy of these sites in every detail. We do not know whether one served as a primary centre and others as regional counterparts, or whether they belong to a more distributed network of communities linked by common symbolic grammar. Yet the very existence of multiple related sites changes the emotional meaning of Göbekli Tepe. The hill is no longer the impossible anomaly of one brilliant group operating outside all pattern. It is the most famous visible crest of a deeper and more extensive world, a world in which early monumental ritual had become a serious and repeated cultural project. This enlarges the human picture tremendously. Imagine the plateau and surrounding lands not as a blank space punctuated by a single ceremonial ridge, but as a textured sacred geography. Paths link valleys and uplands. Communities know of more than one special place. Some sites may carry older authority. Others may rise in importance later. Some may focus on particular rites, lineages, or gatherings. Knowledge moves between them with people, stories, marriages, and seasonal circulation. Stoneworkers, ritual specialists, and elders may have travelled or at least exchanged influence within this wider horizon. The first monumental age of humanity was not a single point. It was a landscape of related experiments in meaning. That possibility helps explain the maturity of the symbolism at Göbekli Tepe. Mature systems generally arrive through repetition, variation, and transmission. The T-shaped pillars, the animal reliefs, the carefully structured spaces, all suggest traditions already shared and refined. When similar forms appear elsewhere, we are seeing the archaeology of cultural conversation, not conversation in writing, but in design, habit, and memory. A pillar form repeated across sites is like a word spoken in different dialects. It signals belonging to a common world, even when each place gives that world its own accent. Karahan Tepe also reminds us that much of this story is still emerging. For decades, Göbekli Tepe seemed almost too startling to belong comfortably within a broader frame. Now the frame is expanding. Other sites in the Tash Tepeler zone and beyond are beginning to show that monumental and communal architecture had deeper roots across the region than once thought. This does not diminish Göbekli Tepe, it makes it more intelligible. It places the site where truly important discoveries belong, not outside history, but inside a larger historical pattern that had simply not yet been seen clearly. Answerless, adrift to ponder, we may consider what this means for the people themselves. They were not isolated geniuses working in silence atop one enchanted hill. They were members of an interconnected cultural world. Their ideas of sacred space, animal power, human form, memory, and communal labour circulated across a network of places and people. This implies travel, recognition, and a horizon of shared understanding much broader than the smallest local band. Civilization in its earliest form may therefore have been less about the rise of one dominant centre, and more about the spread of a ceremonial landscape, a web of places that helped shape identity before formal states ever existed. This also complicates the idea of the first temple. If multiple early monumental sites were active across the region, then the language of firstness becomes slippery. Göbekli Tepe may still be one of the earliest and most spectacular known examples of such architecture, but it should perhaps be understood less as the singular first temple, and more as one of the earliest monumental nodes in a sacred world just beginning to come into view. That may be historically more accurate and, in its own way, even more profound. Human beings were not building one isolated miracle. They were participating in a whole regional shift toward communal symbolic construction. There is a wider philosophical lesson here too. Archaeology often advances by breaking our habit of imagining the past in tidy compartments. We like lone beginnings because they are easy to narrate. The first city, the first king, the first temple. But real human change is usually regional, overlapping, and distributed. Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe together suggest that the roots of monumental ritual lie in shared cultural momentum, not in a single isolated invention. Sacred architecture did not appear from nowhere. It emerged from a broader human readiness to gather, carve, remember, and invest labour in places larger than household life. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. That phrase has special force here because the earth of Upper Mesopotamia has already shown how incomplete our map still is. More buried sites may wait beneath other ridges. More enclosures may lie under known mounds not yet fully understood. Each new excavation has the power to redraw the early sacred landscape. What seems exceptional now may one day appear as part of a still larger constellation. That possibility should keep us humble. The first monumental age may be far richer than the small surviving sample currently visible. For now, though, one truth stands firm. Göbekli Tepe was not alone. Its stone circles and carved beings belong to a regional world of experiment, memory, and sacred ambition. Karahan Tepe and other related sites show that early Neolithic people across this land were engaged in something larger than local custom. They were making centres. They were shaping a ceremonial geography. They were, in a very real sense, building the first broad landscapes of collective meaning. So the hill of Göbekli Tepe now appears not as a solitary wonder rising from darkness, but as one bright fire in a chain of ancient light spread across the highlands of early Mesopotamia. And in that widening view, the human story becomes larger, stranger, and even more beautiful than before. If Göbekli Tepe marks one of the earliest great concentrations of sacred labour, then its ending invites one of the hardest questions in archaeology. What causes a place of such importance to lose its hold on the living? There is a natural tendency to search for a dramatic collapse. Fire, invasion, famine, sudden catastrophe. We are drawn to endings that announce themselves clearly, because they satisfy the imagination. They provide a final blow, a clean explanation, a moment when history visibly breaks. But Göbekli Tepe does not offer such simplicity. Its disappearance from active monumental use seems less like a violent destruction and more like a long withdrawal, a relinquishing of one form of life as another gathered force. That does not make the ending less important. It makes it more human. Great centres do not always die in flames. Sometimes they are outgrown. Sometimes they are transformed by the very social energies they helped create. Sometimes a place becomes too expensive, too distant, too tied to an older order of meaning to remain central in a changing world. What ends at Göbekli Tepe may therefore not be a civilization in the later sense, but a social pattern, the pattern of large-scale ritual aggregation on a monumental hill may have ceased to fit the needs of communities becoming more settled, more local, more invested in fields, houses, and storage. The sacred centre did not necessarily fail. It may simply have become historically obsolete. Still, for the most part, as secrets remain hidden, there is no surviving testimony from the people themselves to tell us whether they felt sorrow, relief, indifference, or reverence as the site passed out of use. Yet several broad forces can be considered. One is environmental adjustment. Even without a singular climatic catastrophe, changing local conditions could alter the costs and benefits of gathering at a hilltop centre. Resource zones shift, herd movements fluctuate, water access matters. As communities became more anchored to emerging settlements, the practical effort of travelling to and sustaining large gatherings at Göbekli Tepe may have grown less attractive compared with maintaining ritual closer to home. Another force is economic transformation. The slow rise of cultivation changes everything. Once people begin investing more labour in plant management, seasonal calendars tighten, harvest windows matter, land near settlements becomes more valuable. Storage creates new responsibilities. You cannot simply leave fields or food reserves unattended for long periods without consequence. A mobile or semi-mobile life can support large regional assembly in one way. A more rooted agricultural life supports it in another, often narrower one. As the economic centre of gravity shifted toward household production and local settlement continuity, the old monumental ridge may have demanded too much for too little direct return. This does not mean the people became less spiritual. It may mean they became spiritual differently. Ritual in settled communities often moves inward. It attaches itself to houses, courtyards, village shrines, burials beneath floors, and local ancestral places. The sacred becomes woven more tightly into everyday life, rather than concentrated at distant regional nodes. In such a transition, Göbekli Tepe might not have lost holiness. It might simply have lost singular necessity. Communities no longer needed to climb the ridge to find the centre of their world, because the centre had multiplied into the fabric of settlement itself. There is also the issue of social scale. Monumental centres require cooperation across dispersed groups. That cooperation is powerful, but it can also be fragile. Alliances shift, networks narrow, competition emerges. If different communities began to focus more intensely on their own settlements and territories, then the regional cohesion needed to maintain a site like Göbekli Tepe may have weakened. A sacred place can survive only as long as enough people agree that it still matters in the old way. Once that consensus frays, even slowly, architecture can remain physically imposing while socially hollowing out, answerless, adrift to ponder. We might imagine a generation for whom the great enclosures no longer feel fully legible. The pillars still stand. The carvings still command attention. The old stories are still remembered, but perhaps imperfectly. Fewer people make the journey. The gatherings are smaller. The labour required to repair, maintain, or build anew feels harder to justify. Younger people may be more attached to their village, their fields, their local dead, their own immediate obligations. The hill remains potent, but its authority is no longer unquestioned. Under such conditions, sacred closure becomes possible. There may also have been ideological change. Human symbolic systems are never static. The very world that built the great circles may have produced new ritual needs incompatible with the old architecture. Smaller rectilinear structures in later phases hint at a shift not only in building form but perhaps in ritual logic. The circle may have belonged to one cosmological grammar, the rectangle to another. Monumental anthropomorphic pillars may have expressed a sacred order that was gradually replaced by more domestic, localized, or differently organized forms of ceremony. If so, the end of Göbekli Tepe was not a collapse into emptiness, but a transition in the language of the sacred itself. Some may wonder whether conflict played a role. It is possible, but the site does not present the obvious signatures of sudden violent overthrow that one might expect from a simple invasion narrative. That absence matters. Archaeology must resist the temptation to make every ending dramatic. Human communities often change course through accumulation rather than rupture. Habits shift, priorities drift, institutions lose force. A place once unimaginable without people becomes imaginable without them. That kind of ending is harder to narrate, but it is often truer to life. The intentional backfilling of the enclosures remains central here. It suggests that Göbekli Tepe did not simply decay beyond use. It was actively concluded. That act implies awareness. People knew the old spaces were ending and chose to seal them. This is why the best explanation may combine several forces rather than isolating one. Economic reorganization, settlement growth, shifting ritual forms, and weakening regional aggregation could all have converged. Together they would make the great hilltop circles less sustainable and less necessary. Burial then becomes the final social solution, a respectful and decisive way to end a monumental tradition. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. More precise dating, wider regional comparisons, and deeper excavation may eventually sharpen the tempo of this transition. We may learn whether different enclosures fell out of use at different times, whether some lingered longer than others, or whether nearby sites reveal parallel transformations in more detail. Yet even now the outline is persuasive. Göbekli Tepe did not die because its builders were defeated by some single calamity. It faded because human life around it was reorganizing at a profound level. That is what makes its ending so moving. The hill was built by communities still living close to wild landscapes, broad mobility, and large ceremonial aggregation. It was relinquished by communities increasingly committed to settlement, cultivation, localized ancestry, and new architectural habits. The sacred labour that once pulled people up the ridge no longer held the same place in their social universe. A different world was being born, and the old one, rather than being smashed, was carefully set aside. So what ended the first temple If temple it was, not one enemy, not one storm, not one fire, but history itself, moving quietly through food, place, memory, and belief until the great stone circles belonged more to the past than to the future. In the end, Göbekli Tepe leaves us with more than a prehistoric puzzle. It leaves us with a mirror, not a mirror in which we see ourselves clearly, but one dimmed by immense time, cracked by burial, and lit only from certain angles. Yet even through that distance, the hill returns a recognizable image. Human beings gathering under the open sky. Human hands shaping stone into meanings greater than the individual life. Human communities confronting death, danger, memory, hunger, and change not only with tools, but with symbols. That is why this place matters so deeply. It is not merely old, it is intimate with the question of what kind of creature we became when we first began to build, not only for shelter, but for significance. By the time Göbekli Tepe passed out of active monumental use, the world that created it was already becoming another world. Fields were tightening their hold on time, settlements were growing more rooted, the broad rhythm of seasonal assembly was yielding, slowly and unevenly, to the denser logic of village life. The great circles on the ridge were buried. New forms of architecture, new forms of ritual, and new forms of power took shape elsewhere. Eventually there would be cities, priest-kings, tablets, walls, armies, taxes, and all the heavy machinery of history proper. In that later world, sacred architecture would return in immense abundance. Temples would rise beside rivers. Gods would receive names, hymns, inventories, and official calendars. Stone would once again become the language of divine order, and yet something about Göbekli Tepe remains unmatched. Because here, before all that, before writing and empire, before palace and law code, there is already grandeur, already a willingness to gather many hands around a task that cannot be explained by survival alone, already the desire to mark a place as different from all others, already the intuition that the human community must sometimes step outside ordinary life and stand together among powers it cannot fully name. That intuition is one of the oldest things in us. The hill preserves it. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know what voices rose between the pillars. We do not know whether the people who stood there felt awe in the same way we use the word now, or whether their emotional world was organized according to categories we have long since lost. We do not know whether the central monoliths were thought of as ancestors, spirits, gods, or beings for whom no modern term is adequate. We do not know why some animals were carved and not others, why some spaces were enlarged and others filled, why the final bearing was accepted or demanded. The sight gives us enough to be astonished, but not enough to be complacent, and perhaps that is a gift. Modern people are accustomed to thinking of the past as incomplete, mainly because it lacked what we value: technology, literacy, bureaucracy, speed, accumulation. Göbekli Tepe reverses that perspective. It shows us a past incomplete to us not because it was lesser, but because it was differently whole. These people did not need writing to create memory. They did not need kings to create authority. They did not need cities to create monumental space. They were our intellectual and emotional equals facing a world of wild animals, unstable climates, bodily risk, and the newly rising possibility of settlement. Their solutions were not primitive versions of ours. They were answers to a human condition still fresh enough to be dangerous. Answerless or adrift to ponder, we are left with a more difficult and more beautiful picture of early civilization. It may not have begun with walls around fields, but with circles around meaning. It may not have begun with grain storage alone, but with gatherings that made grain worth managing. It may not have begun with the state, but with the sacred concentration of people, labour, memory, and image in places set apart. Civilization, in this deeper sense, was not merely the triumph of control over nature. It was the creation of shared worlds inside nature, worlds made durable by ritual, architecture, and return. That is the legacy of Göbekli Tepe, not simply that it might be the first temple, though that phrase still carries power, not simply that it is old beyond easy comprehension, though it certainly is. Its deeper legacy is that it expands the horizon of what we think early humans could do and why they did it. It reminds us that symbolic ambition is ancient, that collective meaning can precede administrative complexity, that wonder, fear, memory, and the urge to stand together in special places may be among the true foundation stones of civilization. There is humility in that realization. The long road of human history did not begin with us becoming clever enough to exploit the world. It began with us becoming sensitive enough to sacralize it, disciplined enough to gather for it, and restless enough to transform it in response. That path would lead eventually to both beauty and burden. Temples, yes, but also armies. Cities, yes, but also inequality. Writing, yes, but also the bureaucratic hardening of life into account and decree. Every later achievement carries shadows, yet on the hill of Göbekli Tepe, before so many later structures had hardened, we glimpse an earlier chapter in which collective human effort still feels almost innocent in its scale, though not naive, and almost pure in its symbolic daring, though not simple. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. That line must remain true here more than almost anywhere. Much of the mound remains unexcavated. The wider sacred landscape of Upper Mesopotamia is still emerging from the ground. Karahan Tepe and related sites have already shown that Göbekli Tepe is part of a larger story. Other buried places may yet reveal older enclosures, different symbolic systems, or new evidence about diet, ancestry, leadership, and ritual life. Our picture is incomplete, and it will change. Good archaeology always leaves room for revision, yet the central wonder will remain. No future discovery can take away the shock that human beings, more than 11,000 years ago, raised monumental stone in a world not yet organized by the institutions we once thought necessary for such things. And so we leave the hill as evening comes, the light thins over the Anatolian horizon. Wind moves across the grass, beneath the mound. Pillars remain where ancient hands set them, their carved animals still tense in silence, their faceless bodies still holding whatever meanings were given to them in that first age of gathering. Above them the modern world passes, curious and brief. We arrive with our drones, our cameras, our theories, our radiocarbon dates, our genomic charts, our stratigraphic reports. And still the old place keeps part of itself withheld. It allows us knowledge, but not ownership. That too is part of its dignity. Göbekli Tepe does not simply tell us where history began. It asks whether history began in a way we had not imagined. Not with the city first, not with the king first, not even with the field first, but with a hill, a gathering, a ring of stone, and the human need to make the invisible stand before us in visible form. If that is true, even partly, then the first great chapter of our story was written not in ink but in limestone under an open sky, and there, in the deep silence before recorded history, gods and mortals may not have walked the earth together in the literal sense, but human beings were already building as though the distance between themselves and the sacred had become too important to leave unmarked.